12 years of caving teaches you that the underground is not silent. This is the first thing that surprises people who have never been inside a cave. The assumption that a space with no wind and no animals and no surface activity would be a space without sound. It isn't. Caves are full of the particular sounds that water and rock and air produce when they've been producing them for millions of years. The dripping of formations, the movement of streams, the particular settling noise that limestone makes as it adjusts to the stresses that the mountain above it generates, the breathing of the cave itself, which is a real phenomenon, the exchange of air between the cave interior and the surface driven by the temperature differential that the seasons create, the cave exhaling in summer and inhaling in winter as the air inside and outside reaches and loses equilibrium. These are the sounds that 12 years of caving have cataloged in me below the level of conscious attention, the sounds that the underground makes that I process and identify and file without needing to think about them, the way a person who has lived near a railroad long enough stops hearing the trains. I know what caves sound like. That's what I want you to understand before I tell you what I heard in the cave off. Route 19 inches, Greenbrier County, West Virginia, on an October afternoon that I've been turning over in the 2 years since it happened. I know the difference between the sounds that caves make and the sounds that other things make in caves, and what I heard in the main passage at approximately 200 feet was not a sound that the cave was making. It was a sound that something inside the cave was making, and the difference between those two categories is the difference that 12 years of experience provides, and that no amount of reasonable explanation has been able to collapse since. The cave off Route 19 is not a show cave. It's not a commercial attraction, not a Park Service site, not anything that appears on a tourist map or in a guidebook. It's a limestone solution cave in the Greenbrier Valley Karst, the kind of cave that the local grotto found and documented in the 80s, and that has been in the regional survey archive since then, accessible to cavers who know about it through the network of survey documentation that the grotto maintains. I'd been in it twice before, once with a small group doing the original documentation, and once on my own to complete a section of the survey that the first trip hadn't covered. Both times, the cave had been what moderately technical caves in the Greenbrier Karst tend to be. Interesting geology, good formations in the second chamber, nothing that presented more challenge than the normal physical requirements of moving through limestone passage, and nothing that produced any experience outside the range of what caving normally produces. I went back in October because I had an unfinished survey. The third chamber, the one that the 80s documentation had noted as requiring low crawling to access, had been marked as surveyed in general terms, but the specific formation documentation I wanted wasn't in the archive. I wanted photographs and measurements of the flowstone section that my previous visits had shown was significant, the kind of documentation that belongs in the regional record and that nobody had bothered to complete because nobody had needed it for anything. I had a project that needed it. I had a free Saturday. The weather was dry and clear, which matters for Greenbrier Valley caves because the karst hydrology responds quickly to rain, and dry conditions are the conditions you want when you're in a system that has active stream passages, which this one did. I went alone. I know that's the part that people focus on, and I understand why. Solo caving is not best practice. The grotto's safety guidelines recommend a minimum of 3 cavers in any underground party, the redundancy that 3 people provide when one is incapacitated and one needs to go for help. I know these guidelines and I follow them in technical systems and on unfamiliar terrain. The cave off Route 19 was neither. I'd been in it twice. The survey showed 400 feet of mapped passage with no significant vertical drops and no sumps and nothing that presented the kind of hazard that solo caving guidelines are designed to address. I made a risk calculation that experienced cavers make regularly, and that the outcome of the October trip has made me unwilling to make again, which is its own kind of data about whether the calculation was sound. I parked on the Route 19 shoulder where the unmarked path to the entrance began, and I hiked the quarter-mile to the cave mouth with my pack and my survey gear, arriving at the entrance at approximately 2 in the afternoon. The entrance is a low arch in a limestone outcrop, the opening wide enough to enter without crawling but low enough that you duck. The cave mouth, oriented northeast, and facing away from the afternoon sun, so that the entrance is in shade by mid-morning, and that the particular transition from light to dark happens quickly once you're inside. I turned on my primary headlamp and my backup, and I started down the main passage. The main passage of the cave off Route 19 runs approximately southwest from the entrance, following the joint in the limestone that the dissolution process used to create the cave. The passage tall enough to stand upright in for the first 150 feet, and then dropping to a comfortable stoop for the next 50 feet before opening into the first chamber. The first chamber is where the good formations start, the stalactites and stalagmites that the second phase of the cave's development deposited after the water table dropped and the passage drained, the particular white and cream calcite formations that Greenbrier Valley caves produce when the chemistry is right and the time has been sufficient. I documented the first chamber in maybe 20 minutes, the photographs and the measurements going into the survey log with the routine efficiency that practice produces. I was moving from the first chamber toward the second when I stopped, not for any reason I could have articulated at that moment. The body stopping before the mind had identified what the body had registered, the particular non-volitional halt that happens when something in the environment has changed and the nervous system has caught it before the conscious brain has processed it. I stood in the connecting passage between the first and second chambers, maybe 190 feet from the entrance, with my headlamps showing the passage walls and the survey log in my hand, and I waited for my brain to catch up to whatever my body already knew. The air moved. That's the first thing I was able to name. The air in the passage, which had been in the particular equilibrium that cave air maintains on a dry October day, was moving. Not the steady, slow exchange that the cave's normal breathing produces, not the gentle inhalation or exhalation that the temperature differential drives in the predictable, measured way of cave air that is following the physics of gas equilibrium between two environments. The air was moving with the particular quality of an exhalation, the directed movement of air that is being pushed rather than flowing, the difference between a breeze and a breath. The air was coming from the direction of the deeper passage, from the second chamber and beyond, and it was moving toward me and toward the entrance with the 4-second sustained pressure of something that had pushed it. I noted the temperature of the moving air, warmer than the cave's ambient temperature. The cave off Route 19 maintains approximately 54 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. The thermal equilibrium that caves reach when the mass of rock around them buffers the seasonal temperature variation and produces the constant climate that cave environments are known for. The air coming from the deeper passage was warmer than 54 degrees. Not dramatically, not the warmth of a room or a heated space. The particular warmth of an enclosed space that has been occupied by something that produces heat, the biological warmth that living things generate, the few degrees above ambient that a body in a confined space produces when the space is small enough that the thermal output of the body warms the air. I noted all of this in the survey log. The time, the air movement, the temperature differential, the direction. I noted it with the clinical precision that training produces when the trained part of you is functioning correctly and the animal part of you is doing something else entirely, is doing the particular thing that animal parts do when they have identified a stimulus as belonging to a category that the training doesn't fully address. I wrote the notes in the survey log and I stood in the connecting passage and I listened. The sound came after the exhalation, maybe 30 seconds after the air movement had stopped and the passage had returned to its equilibrium and I was standing in the stillness of a cave that should have been producing only the sounds that caves produce. The sound came from the second chamber or from the passage beyond it, from deeper in the cave, and it traveled through the passage toward me with the particular clarity that cave acoustics provide, the limestone walls and the passage geometry, conducting sound with an efficiency that makes caves extraordinary places, to hear things you would prefer not to hear clearly. It was rhythmic. That's the quality that I registered first. The regularity of it, the particular pattern that repetition creates when something is producing the same sound at consistent intervals. Low in frequency, lower than a voice, but not so low that it was in the range of geological sounds. The particular frequency that the human vocal range sits below and that animal sounds occupy in the register between human speech and the infrasound that earth processes generate. Rhythmic and low and coming from approximately 250 feet away from a section of cave that my previous visits had shown me was empty of any living thing capable of producing what I was hearing. I did not go forward. I want to be honest about this because the honest account of what I did is the account that matters, not the account that a braver or a less experienced person might have produced. I stood in the connecting passage for what I think was about 3 minutes, listening to the sound come through the limestone with the clarity that the cave provided, and I assessed what I was hearing and what I knew about the cave's biology and what the sound's characteristics said about its source. And I turned around and I walked back through the first chamber and through the main passage and out of the entrance at a pace that was not running but that was faster than the pace I'd used going in. I sat on the limestone outcrop outside the entrance for about 20 minutes. The October afternoon was still and clear, the Greenbrier Valley showing its autumn color in the afternoon light, the normal world proceeding in the normal way that the normal world proceeds. I could hear nothing from inside the cave. The entrance, open beside me, showed the darkness of the cave interior and produced no sound and no air movement, and nothing that the afternoon air and the limestone walls held. I drove home. I filed the survey notes the following week, including the airflow observation and the temperature differential and the acoustic anomaly, the clinical language of a caving survey, applied to an experience that the clinical language could contain, but that it could not fully describe. The grotto secretary who processed the survey sent me a message. She said the airflow observation was interesting. She said the cave had been surveyed a dozen times over 40 years, and she'd never seen an airflow notation in any of the previous surveys. She asked if I'd gone into the second chamber. I told her I hadn't made it past the connecting passage. She said that was the second time she'd heard that from someone who'd been in the cave alone in October. She said the first person who'd said something similar had been one of the original survey team from 1987, a caver who had gone back for a solo documentation trip and who had come out early and had filed a survey note that she described as vague, but that she said had the same quality as mine, the particular vagueness of a precise person describing something that their precision is not equipped to name. I went back in March. A 3-person team, the grotto guidelines followed, the survey completed in the second chamber and the third, with no incident, the cave behaving as the survey said it should behave, the formations documented, the measurements taken, the log filled with the data that the October trip had been intended to produce. The second chamber was empty. The third chamber was empty. The cave off Route 19 inches Greenbrier County was, in March, with 3 people, exactly the moderately technical cave system that 400 feet of documented passage and 40 years of survey visits said it was. But I didn't lead the team into the second chamber first. I hung back at the connecting passage while the other 2 went ahead. Old habit, I told them, letting the more experienced cavers check the route. They accepted it without question because the explanation was plausible and because the alternative explanation required me to describe what I'd heard in October, and I wasn't ready to do that in the passage that October had. Produced it. I'm describing it now. The exhalation that lasted 4 seconds and was warmer than the ambient air. The rhythmic low sound that the limestone passage carried toward me from the second chamber, with the particular acoustic clarity of a system that has learned how to transmit what it holds. The 3 minutes I stood in the connecting passage before I turned around. I've been caving for 14 years now. I will go into that cave again. I'll go in with a full team and the proper equipment and the preparation that the survey work requires. I will not go in alone in October. That's the line I've drawn, and I've drawn it not from fear exactly, though fear is present in the drawing, but from the particular respect that 12 years of underground experience has taught me to apply to spaces that have demonstrated they are not simply geological. The cave off Route 19 exhaled. Something in the second chamber was producing warmth and was producing sound on a dry October afternoon when the cave's biology said nothing in the second chamber was large enough to generate either. I was there. I heard it. The survey log has the notation, and the notation is accurate, and what the notation describes is what happened. I've been underground in a lot of places in these mountains. Most of them are exactly what they appear to be. Limestone systems moving through the particular geological processes that limestone systems follow, the water and the dissolution and the deposition and the silence and the dark and the particular beauty that the underground produces when you know how to look at it. Most of them are caves. One of them, on one October afternoon at approximately 200 feet in the connecting passage, was something else. And the something else breathed, and I heard it breathe. And the sound it made after the breathing was the sound of a thing that has been underground long enough to know how the acoustics work and how to use them. And I was 200 feet from the entrance, and I had the good sense to remember where the entrance was. The sump wasn't supposed to be crossable. That's where I need to start, because the impossibility of the footprints depends entirely on understanding the impossibility of what preceded them, the sequence of conditions that had to align for us to be in that passage at all and that made the prints, when we found them, not just disturbing but logistically inexplicable in a way that has occupied a specific corner of my thinking for the 3 years since. The cave system in Pocahontas County, I'll call it the Milligan system, which is the name the university team used in their 1994 survey and which has stuck in the regional documentation, was mapped by a West Virginia University geology team over 2 field seasons in the early 90s. The survey produced 300 meters of documented passage, a good-sized system for the Greenbrier Karst, with 2 main trunk passages connecting a series of smaller side passages and one significant chamber about 180 meters in, where the ceiling lifted to maybe 30 feet and the formation density was high enough that the team spent significant time documenting the speleothems. The survey ended at the sump. The sump was a point in the main trunk passage where the limestone dipped below the water table and the passage filled completely with water, the ceiling and the floor meeting the water surface in a way that left no airspace and no way forward without diving equipment. The university team noted the sump as impassable and ended their survey there. The archive documentation said the system was 300 meters long, sump terminal, with no known extensions beyond the water barrier. Our team was 3 people. Myself, a caver named Renata who had more underground hours than anyone I'd regularly surveyed with, and a younger member of our grotto named Derek who was on his first significant survey trip. The purpose was to update the 1,994 documentation, the kind of resurvey that regional grottos do periodically, when older surveys need photographic updating, or when new measurement techniques can add precision to data that previous teams collected with less sophisticated equipment. We had no expectation of finding anything that the university team hadn't documented. We had no expectation of getting past the sump. October had been dry, in a way that the local old-timers described as unusual, even for a region that cycles through drought patterns, with the regularity that the Appalachian climate produces. By the time we went into the Milligan system on a Saturday in mid-October, the county had been without significant rain for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of no recharge to the karst aquifer. 6 weeks of the water table dropping in the limestone as the springs that fed it ran below their normal flow and the system drained toward its lower equilibrium. We knew the drought conditions going in, and we knew, because cavers who work in active karst systems know these things, that sumps sometimes become passable in extended dry periods when the water table drops enough to open an airspace above the former water ceiling. We reached the sump at approximately 11 in the morning. The passage at the sump was transformed. What the 1,994 survey described as a complete fill, ceiling to floor, was showing an air gap of approximately 18 inches at the top of the passage, the water level having dropped enough in 6 weeks of drought to expose the upper portion of the sump and to create a low but navigable passage above the water surface. 18 inches of airspace above maybe 2 feet of standing water in a passage that was 3 feet tall total. Navigable, barely, for a person willing to keep their face close to the water and their pack dragging on the ceiling and their forward motion slow and controlled. Renata went first. She's the most experienced of the 3 of us, and the decision to attempt the sump was hers to make, and she made it with the particular calm assessment of someone who has been in tight water situations before and who knows the difference between manageable risk and unmanageable risk. She went through in about 4 minutes, the distance being maybe 8 meters of low, wet passage, and she called back from the far side with a voice that had a quality in it. I remember noting, even at that moment, a quality that I categorized as suppressed excitement, and that I later understood was something more complicated than that. Derek and I went through in sequence. The sump passage was cold and close, and the water at my face was the particular cold of cave water that sits at 54 degrees year-round, the temperature that cave environments maintain, and the ceiling was an inch above my headlamp, and the forward motion was slow, and the 8 meters took longer than 4 minutes for me, because I was taller than Renata, and the 18 inches of clearance was 18 inches for a smaller body and slightly less for mine. I came through on the far side, wet to the shoulders and cold, and I stood up in the passage beyond the sump, and I saw Renata's headlamp about 15 meters ahead of me, and I saw that she was standing still and looking at the base floor. The passage beyond the sump was a continuation of the trunk passage on the near side, the same geological character, the same limestone walls, the same low ceiling that the trunk passage maintained. The floor was different. On the near side of the sump, the floor was breakdown. The angular limestone blocks that collapsed passages accumulate, a surface that doesn't hold impressions and that records nothing of the traffic that passes over it. On the far side of the sump, the floor was sediment, the fine mud that cave passages accumulate when they've been repeatedly flooded and when the still water deposits the suspended clay and silt that it carries. The flat, smooth surface of a mud floor that the cave had been building across geological time, and that recorded everything that had contact with it. The way good mud always records contact. The footprints were in the mud from approximately 3 meters beyond the sump exit. Not at the sump exit, 3 meters in, as if whatever made them had started from a point already past the barrier that the sump represented, already in the passage beyond the water, already moving in the direction away from the entrance. They were oriented deeper into the cave, both feet alternating, the gait of a walking person. The particular bilateral pattern that bipedal locomotion produces in a soft substrate, left, right in the spacing of an adult stride. Bare feet. The mud held the detail with the fidelity that fine cave sediment provides when the impression is fresh and when nothing has disturbed it, since the impression was made, and the detail showed toes, 5 on each print, the arch and the ball and the heel in the proportions of a normal adult human foot of maybe size 10 or 11. I stood next to Renata, and we looked at the prints without speaking for long enough that Derek came through the sump and stood up behind us and said, "What are you looking at?" And we showed him, and the 3 of us stood in the passage beyond the sump on a Tuesday morning and looked at the footprints in the mud, and none of us said the thing that the prints made obvious, which was that the passage had no entry point we knew of, that the sump had been closed to any human passage for however many years the drought conditions had been insufficient to open it, and that the prints were fresh, the mud around them still holding the moisture that recent impressions retain when the substrate is wet enough to record them cleanly. We followed them. I want to be clear about the decision and about what motivated it, because the decision deserves examination. We followed the prints deeper into the cave, away from the sump and the exit it represented, into a section of passage that no survey had documented and that we were the first people to be standing in, as far as any documentation confirmed. We followed them because we were cavers doing a survey, and the prints were evidence of something that the survey needed to account for, because the rational framework that survey work provides was the framework we were operating in, and the rational framework said that footprints in a cave are the footprints of a person, and the person needed to be found. The passage continued for approximately 40 meters past the sump before it changed character. For those 40 meters, the mud floor showed the prints continuous and consistent, the same stride, the same bare feet, the same unhurried spacing. There was no variation in the prints. The stride didn't shorten, didn't lengthen, didn't show the irregularities that terrain variation produces when a person is moving through a cave passage in the dark and adjusting their gait to the obstacles and the surfaces that the underground presents. The prints were perfectly regular, in the way that prints are regular when they're made by something that doesn't need to adjust to the terrain that moves through the passage, with the familiarity of long repetition, or with the certainty of something that doesn't require the navigation that we required. We called out twice. Standard procedure. The voice projected into the passage ahead where the prints continued. The standard identification of our presence that any caver would use when entering a section of cave where another person might be present. The passage carried our voices in the particular way that cave acoustics carry sound, the limestone conducting the call forward into the dark, and the passage returned nothing. No answer, no acknowledgement, no sound of movement from ahead that would have indicated a person who had heard us and was responding in some way. The passage narrowed at 40 meters. A crawl, the ceiling dropping and the walls closing to a space that required us to go to hands and knees to proceed. The prints continued into the crawl. The mud in the crawl showed the same footprints, the same spacing, the stride changing not at all as the passage height dropped, as if the change in the passage geometry had produced no change in the movement of whatever was making the prints. No handprints in the mud, no impression of knees, only the footprints, continuing into the crawl with the same regular spacing and the same bare foot impressions as if a person had walked upright through a passage that the geometry said required crawling. Renata went to the crawl entrance and shone her light into the passage. The prints were visible in her beam for maybe 6 or 7 meters before the passage bent and the view ended. She came back to where Derek and I were standing, and she said she wasn't going into the crawl. She said it with the flatness of a final decision, not a debate or a consultation. She said it and Derek and I understood it, and we didn't debate it because the same conclusion had been building in each of us through the 40 meters of prints and the 2 unanswered calls and the stride that hadn't changed when the ceiling dropped. We went back to the sump. The return trip covered the 40 meters of prints in the particular silence of 3 people who are not talking, because the talking would require them to say things that the situation has produced, and that the saying would make more real than the not saying. We crossed the sump in reverse, the cold water at our faces, the ceiling an inch from the headlamps, and we came through on the near side, and we sat on the breakdown for a while without getting up. Renata documented the prints in the survey log before we left. She wrote the description with the precision that her experience provided, the dimensions of the prints, the stride length, the number visible, the direction of travel, the substrate conditions, the location relative to the sump. She wrote it in the same clinical language that cave surveys use for geological data, and she said nothing beyond what the language contained, and I said nothing beyond what she said, and Derek said nothing at all. The survey we submitted to the regional archive included the discovery of the passage beyond the sump and the footprint documentation. The archive coordinator who processed the submission called me the following month. She'd consulted with the university team members who had conducted the 1,994 survey, 2 of whom were still reachable. She asked them about the sump, about whether it had ever been passable in their experience, about whether they had any knowledge of the passage beyond the water barrier. They said the sump had been completely full in both field seasons. They said they had no knowledge of any passage beyond it and no knowledge of any other entry point to the Milligan system that would have allowed access from the far side. She asked me if I had any explanation for the prints. I told her I didn't. She said that was consistent with what she'd expected me to say. She said it with the particular resignation of someone who has processed regional caving documentation for long enough to have encountered this category of response before. The category of, I documented what I found, and what I found I cannot explain. I've been back to the Milligan system twice since. The sump refilled with the return of rain in November and has not been passable in the 2 subsequent seasons. The passage beyond the sump is behind a water barrier that an adult human cannot cross without diving equipment and without the particular drought conditions that October provided once in 6 weeks of dry weather. Whatever was walking in that passage, whatever made the prints in the mud with the unhurried stride and the bare feet and the gait that didn't change when the ceiling dropped, was there before we opened the passage and will be there when the water rises and closes it again. It wasn't trying to leave. The direction of the prints is the detail I keep returning to. The detail that the survey log records with the accuracy of a measurement and that I haven't been able to set down in the 2 years since the survey. The prints went deeper, not toward the sump, not toward the opening, not in the direction that an exit lay, deeper, into the mountain, into the passage that the crawl continued into past the point where our lights reached and where Renata's flat final voice said she wasn't going. I respect that decision. I've made it a permanent part of my own practice. There are passages in these mountains that continue past the point where the survey ends, and the survey ends where it ends for reasons that aren't always geological. Sometimes the survey ends where the reasonable people stopped following what they found, and what they found kept going. The permit took 3 weeks to process. which was longer than I'd expected for what the Historical Society described as a routine documentation request. I'd applied in May, and the approval came back in late June with a 2-page letter outlining the conditions of access, the standard language about not disturbing formations and not removing artifacts and reporting anything of historical significance, and a note at the bottom from the Society's director saying that the key was available for pickup at their office in Lewisburg and that the cave's current condition was unknown, their last internal inspection having been conducted in 2019. Unknown condition meant they hadn't been inside in 4 years, and that whatever the cave had been doing in the interval between inspections it had been doing without witnesses. I noted that and filed it and drove to Lewisburg to pick up the key. Harmon's Hole is in Greenbrier County, off a county road that the maps show but that the road surface suggests is not heavily maintained, the kind of road that exists primarily to provide legal access to the properties along it, and that the county paves once a decade, whether it needs it or not. The cave entrance is on what was once private farmland, donated to the County Historical Society in the 1970s, along with the archive of commercial operation materials that the Harmon family had kept in boxes since the business closed in 1931. The donation included the original survey map, the operational records, the ticket stubs, and the promotional materials, and the particular paper archaeology of a small commercial enterprise that someone had been thorough enough to preserve. The Historical Society had digitized most of it and made it available through their archive, and I'd spent several evenings with the digitized materials before my visit, orienting myself to what the cave had looked like when it was operational and what the survey map said I should expect to find. The survey map was hand-drawn, the kind of cave map that the early 20th century produced, when the tools were a compass and a tape measure, and the cartographer was usually the cave's owner, working from memory and intuition as much as from systematic measurement. It showed 3 chambers connected by passages, the chambers numbered in the order that the tourist route had visited them. The first chamber near the entrance where the tickets were collected and the introduction given, the second chamber where the best formations were, and where the tour's centerpiece was a column formation that the promotional materials called the cathedral pillar, the third chamber at the back of the system where the tour ended and where the map showed a dead end, the passage closing against a wall of rock. The map showed approximately 200 meters of cave from entrance to the back wall of the third chamber, a modest system by regional standards, but enough to sustain the kind of modest commercial operation that the Harmon family had run for a decade before the Depression made the economics unworkable. I went in on a Wednesday in mid-July, a clear, hot day on the surface that was irrelevant underground, where the temperature held at 55 degrees regardless of what the July air above was doing. The entrance gate was iron, set into the rock of the entrance arch, and the key was an old skeleton key that opened the padlock with the stiffness of a mechanism that hadn't been operated in several years, the tumblers moving but reluctantly, the lock opening with the particular resistance that disused hardware produces. I swung the gate inward and turned on my headlamps and went in. The historical archaeology was exactly what I'd come for. The wooden walkways were still in place. Remarkably, the boards grayed and some of them soft with the moisture that cave environments maintain, but the structure intact along most of the route. The iron supports holding the planks above the cave floor in the configuration that the Harmon operation had installed sometime in the early 1920s. The iron handrail fittings were there, the brackets that had held a rope or chainrail along the walkway's edge, the hardware showing the particular patina of iron that has spent 90 years in a humid limestone environment, dark brown and slightly soft on the surface, but solid underneath. The lantern hooks were there, the ceiling bolts from which the Harmon guides had hung their lanterns at intervals along the tour route, the hooks spaced maybe 10 feet apart, in the pattern that kerosene lantern illumination required when the cave was being shown to paying visitors in the era before electric light. I documented all of it. The photography was systematic, the kind of grid-based documentation that historical archaeology uses when the goal is a complete record rather than artistic representation, every feature photographed from multiple angles, every structural element measured and described in the notes that I was keeping in a waterproof field book. The first chamber took me about an hour. The second chamber, with the cathedral pillar and the concentration of formations that the commercial operation had centered its presentation on took me nearly 2 hours. The formation density requiring more photographs, and the walkway in the second chamber showing more structural variation that needed documentation. By the time I reached the connecting passage to the third chamber, it was past noon and I had been in the cave for over 3 hours. The third chamber was where the tour had ended. The map showed it as a roughly oval room approximately 20 meters across, with the walkway terminating at a wooden platform near the back wall and the return route retracing the tour path back to the entrance. The chamber was, as the map showed it, the oval shape correct, the platform at the back still standing, with the particular dilapidated dignity of a structure that was built to hold tourists and that has been holding nothing but cave air for 90 years. I documented the platform and the chamber and the formation features and the back wall of the cave, the wall that the map showed as the system's terminus. The gap in the back wall was behind a flowstone formation, not a narrow crack, not the kind of marginal opening that cavers catalog as too tight to enter and that the original survey would have noted even if it was impassable. A gap of approximately 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, screened from the main chamber by a curtain of flowstone that hung from the ceiling in the way that flowstone curtains hang when the calcite has deposited along a drip line and built down over time, the formation thick enough and complete enough in its coverage that you would not see the gap behind it unless you were at the right angle or unless you moved the curtain, which was not something that any tourist tour would have done and which the original survey apparently hadn't done either or had done and chosen not to document. I found it because I was doing complete documentation, and complete documentation means checking every wall surface in every chamber, and when I reached the back wall section behind the flowstone curtain, I moved to the angle that showed what was behind it and I saw the gap. I stood at the gap and shone my headlamp through, and the room on the other side showed itself in the light. Small, as I said, maybe 15 feet across, roughly circular, the ceiling low at about 6 feet. The geology was the same as the rest of the cave. The limestone walls with a particular surface texture that solution caves produce, the floor, a mix of the soft sediment that cave floors accumulate, and the occasional breakdown block. The room had the character of a space that the cave's hydrology had created, and then left undisturbed. No active formations, no drip lines, no evidence of current water activity. A dry, still, enclosed space that the flowstone curtain had screened from the rest of the cave. The things in the room were arranged along the walls, not stacked, not deposited the way objects are deposited when someone carries them in and sets them down wherever is convenient. Arranged. The word is the right word, and I've thought about whether a different word would be more accurate, and I keep coming back to arranged. The particular disposition of objects that reflects the application of intention to their placement, the care that you can see in the position of things that were put where they are by someone who was thinking about where they should go. I'm going to describe what I found because the description is the document, and the document is what I have. There were ceramic pieces, fragments, and some intact vessels, the kind of utilitarian earthenware that mountain communities used in the 19th century and earlier, the plain, unglazed pottery of a domestic tradition that predated the commercial pottery that the industrial period introduced. Some of the fragments had been placed upright, leaned against the wall in positions that said the placing was deliberate. There were iron implements, tools of some kind, their function not immediately clear to me. The metal showing the particular deterioration that iron undergoes in a humid cave environment over an extended period. The surfaces reduced to the particular brown that long oxidation produces. There were organic materials, dried and desiccated by the dry conditions of the room, things that had been plant material of some kind, and that the cave's consistent temperature had preserved in the particular state of very old dried organic matter, neither decomposed nor intact, held in the particular arrested state that dry cave environments produce. And there were other things that I documented with the same systematic photography and the same notes, and that I have not described publicly, because the description produces responses that the documentation doesn't support. I photographed for about 40 minutes. I did not touch anything. The conditions of my permit specified no removal and no disturbance, and beyond the permit conditions, there was something in the room that made the non-disturbance feel less like compliance and more like the correct relationship to maintain with what I was looking at. I filed the report with the Historical Society the following week. The photographs, the measurements, the written description, all of it organized in the format that historical documentation uses and submitted with the particular thoroughness that I bring to documentation work. The director, a woman named Margaret, who I'd met when I picked up the key, and who had the particular manner of someone who has spent a career managing a historical archive in a region that has more history than it wants to fully examine, called me 2 days after I submitted the report. She said the room appeared on no survey they had, not the 1920s operational map, and not a more recent geological survey that a state university team had done in the 1980s. A survey that would have been systematic enough to find a 2-foot gap behind a flowstone curtain if anyone had been looking. The room was not in the record. She said she'd consulted with a colleague who specialized in regional material culture about the ceramic pieces in my photographs. She said her colleague had found the dating difficult because the forms in the clay body were consistent with a tradition that the regional archaeological record placed in a period considerably earlier than the commercial operation. She said some of the other objects were harder to place, and that her colleague had asked whether she could have access to the originals, which led to the question of whether the objects could be removed for examination. I told her what the permit said. She said yes, the permit conditions would need to be amended, and she said she would work on that, and then she paused in the particular way that pauses carry weight when the person pausing is deciding how much to say, and she said there was one more thing. She said she had located a reference in the Harmon family papers, in the portion of the archive that she described as the materials the family had retained rather than donated, which she had accessed through a conversation with the last surviving Harmon descendant in the county. She said there was a brief notation in a letter from the founder of the commercial operation, dated 1922, a letter to a business partner discussing the preparations for the cave's opening. She said the letter mentioned the back room. She said the founder's notation about it was brief, and that she read it to me verbatim, and she read it. The notation said, "Room in the third chamber not to be shown, was there before." She read it, and I sat with what it meant, and she sat with what it meant, and neither of us said anything for a moment. She said she didn't know what the founder meant by before. Before the commercial operation, presumably. Before the survey that had produced the operational map. She said she was going to look further into the Harmon papers, and she would be in touch. She hasn't been in touch in the 8 months since that call. I've tried to reach her twice, and both times received responses from the Historical Society's administrative staff saying that Dr. Margaret was unavailable and would return my inquiry when she was able. She hasn't been able in 8 months. I don't know what she found in the Harmon papers, and I don't know whether the amendment to my permit to allow object examination has been processed, and I don't know whether anyone has been back into Harmon's hole since my visit. What I know is what I documented. A room behind a flowstone curtain that the survey didn't show, holding objects that a material culture specialist found difficult to date, in a cave that a letter from 1922 suggested its owner knew about and decided to keep out of the tourist route. A room that was there, the notation said, before. Before, whatever before meant to the man who found it, and who chose to screen it behind the flowstone curtain and take his visitors in the other direction and not write it on the map. The key is still in my possession. I haven't returned it. The permit is technically expired, but the key is in my desk drawer, and the cave is in Greenbrier County, and the room is behind the flowstone curtain in the third chamber at the back of the system, holding what it has been holding since before the commercial operation, and before the survey, and before whatever the before in that 1922 letter was referring to. And Dr. Margaret isn't returning calls, and the things in the room are where they were placed, and they have been there, arranged as they are, for longer than the record explains. Cave diving is a discipline that the broader caving community regards with the particular mixture of respect and bewilderment that any specialized practice generates in the people who share its general domain without sharing its specific risks. Regular cavers understand the underground in the way that people who spend years in limestone systems understand it, the geology and the hydrology, and the particular physical demands of moving through rock, but regular cavers also understand that a sump represents a boundary, a place where the cave continues, and the caver does not, the water barrier that terminates a survey and sends the team back to the surface. Cave divers are the people who treat that boundary as an invitation rather than a terminus, who bring tanks and wetsuits and the specific training that underwater cave navigation requires, and who go through the water and continue the cave on the other side. I have been doing this for 11 years. I have pushed sumps in Virginia and West Virginia and Tennessee, and once in Florida, where the cave diving is technically easier and fundamentally more terrifying because the visibility is perfect and the size of what you're inside becomes fully apparent in a way that the limited visibility of Appalachian sumps mercifully obscures. I know the risk and I manage the risk, and the risk management has been sufficient for 11 years. I am describing all of this because the room beyond the third sump in the Bath County system was the first thing I have encountered underground that made me uncertain whether the risk management was adequate, whether any preparation I could have done would have been the right preparation for what the room contained. The system in Bath County, I've been calling it the Laurel system in my notes, for the creek that drains the hollow above it, though it has no official name in any archive I've found, was brought to my attention by a landowner who had grown up knowing about the cave entrance on his family's property, and who had explored the first section as a teenager, and who contacted our grotto through a mutual connection. When he became concerned that the entrance was unstable and might collapse, the grotto sent a team to assess the entrance stability and to do a preliminary survey of whatever the cave contained. The preliminary survey found 340 meters of passage and 3 sumps. The first 2 sumps were short, 4 meters and 7 meters respectively, manageable by any trained cave diver in good conditions. The third sump was longer, the survey team estimating maybe 15 meters, based on the passage geometry and the water surface behavior, though they hadn't dived it and the estimate was exactly that. The third sump ended the survey. The team documented what they'd found and filed it in the regional archive, and noted the third sump as a potential extension point for a future diving team. I went the first time with a partner named Gil. The standard cave diving protocol of never diving alone applied with more discipline in an unsurveyed system than in a known one. The conditions were good, the cave running low after a dry stretch, the sumps showing the reduced flow that makes free diving them manageable, the water clear enough that my headlamp showed several meters of passage ahead during the dives. The first sump and the second sump went according to the survey team's description. The third sump I reached and assessed and turned back from. The passage geometry suggested the 15-meter estimate was optimistic, and the air in my lungs at the entry point, assessed against the distance I was looking at and the return trip required, put the margin tighter than I was comfortable with. I turned back. Gil had already turned back at the second sump, the passage being tighter than he was comfortable with, and we returned to the surface together. And I filed a note with my assessment, and we planned a second attempt with better preparation. The second attempt I went alone through the first 2 sumps, which I'll acknowledge was outside protocol, and which I justify only by saying that 2 successful dives through those passages had given me information that changed the risk calculation. I pushed to the third sump and assessed again and turned back again. The passage was longer than 15 meters, my headlamp showing no exit aperture in the distance the light reached, and the free diving of an unknown length sump with no turning back available once committed is a calculation that I need to be very sure about before I commit to it. I wasn't sure enough on the second attempt. I went back. The third attempt was in September of the year I need to tell you about, after a summer that had been dry enough to drop the water table in the Bath County karst to a level that the old-timers said was unusual for any year they could remember. I was alone again, which I'm not proud of and which I won't defend except to say that the particular tunnel vision that an unresolved caving objective produces in a person who has been thinking about it for months is a psychological state that the rational mind observes and struggles to override. I went through the first 2 sumps with the improved margin that the low water provided, and I reached the third sump in better condition than either previous attempt, and I assessed the passage and the visibility and my air supply, and I went through. Free diving a sump means holding your breath and pulling yourself through a water-filled passage by the handholds that the rock provides, moving hand over hand through the submerged rock with your lights showing the passage ahead and the passage behind and the water around you and nothing else. The third sump in the Laurel system was 12 meters, which I know because I've measured it subsequently on dives with proper equipment. That September it felt longer than 12 meters, because September dive visibility in a Appalachian cave sump is not the crystal clarity of a Florida spring, but the particular murk of water that carries the dissolved minerals and the suspended particles of a karst system that has been processing groundwater for geological time, and the murk limits your light to maybe 2 meters ahead and compresses the perception of distance in a way that makes 12 meters feel like 20. I pulled through the passage in the particular controlled urgency of a free dive. No panic, nothing wasted, the motion efficient, and the air management deliberate, and the passage ended, and the ceiling lifted, and I surfaced. The chamber was not what I expected to surface into. When you exit a sump, you expect a low, wet passage, the continuation of the cave at sump level, the gradual transition from water to airspace that sump exits typically provide. I surfaced into a room. Not a passage, not a crawl, a room with a ceiling that my headlamp showed at approximately 15 feet above the water surface, and walls that my light found at maybe 20 feet in every direction. I hung in the water at the sump exit, and I moved my head to take in the room, and the room resolved itself in my headlamp beam as a chamber, with the particular character of cave spaces that have been above the water table for a very long time, dry and still, the formations on the walls, showing the white and cream calcite of old deposition, the floor above the water ledge, showing the flat sediment of a surface that had been deposited and undisturbed. I pulled myself out of the water onto the ledge that formed the room's floor. The air was breathable, which I confirmed not by instrument but by the simple test of breathing it, the particular assessment that your body performs automatically when you surface in an underground airspace, the quality of the air registering as adequate before any conscious measurement is applied. The room was approximately 40 feet across. I stood on the sediment floor with cave water draining from my wetsuit, and I turned slowly in place and let my headlamp cover the walls. The marks were everywhere. Every wall surface, from the floor to approximately shoulder height, covered in the marks that hands had made on limestone. Not graffiti in any sense that word carries from the modern tradition, not names or dates or the casual vandalism that accessible caves accumulate when they've been visited by people with sharp objects and the impulse to leave evidence of their presence. These marks had the character of intentional application, the particular quality of marks that are made because the making matters, because what is being put on the wall is meant to be on the wall, and is placed with the care that meaning requires. Lines, patterns, the particular geometry of marks that recur and relate to each other across the wall surface, creating a coverage that was not random, and that was not the geological patterning of water and dissolution and mineral deposition, but the deliberate application of something to rock by something that had decided what it wanted the rock to hold. I have some background in regional archaeology. Not formal training, but the reading that a decade of caving in an archaeologically rich region accumulates in a person who pays attention. I know what pictographs look like. I know what the archaeological record of indigenous presence in Appalachian caves looks like. The charcoal marks and the mineral pigments and the particular styles of pre-contact cave art that the regional record has documented in a handful of sites across Virginia and West Virginia and Tennessee. What I was looking at was not that. The marks in the Laurel System chamber did not have the character of the pre-contact tradition that I recognized from that record. The marks were older in the particular way that things can look older than the oldest things you have a reference for, the way a sediment layer looks when it's below the stratum that the dating says is the bottom. I photographed for as long as my equipment allowed, approximately 40 minutes. I documented the chamber dimensions and the wall coverage and the mark characteristics with the notation that the survey form provided, and with the additional description that the survey form's categories didn't capture. I documented the sediment floor and the absence of any other entry point, the walls unbroken by any passage, entrance, or crack that could have allowed access by a route other than the sump. The sump was the only way in. 3 sumps in sequence, the third of them 12 meters in conditions I'd assessed as requiring specific preparation and specific conditions. Whatever had made the marks had come through those sumps, or had come from somewhere that the room's walls showed no evidence of. I went back through the third sump and through the second and the first, and I sat in the cave's main passage for a while before I went to the surface. The sitting was not rest, it was the particular pause of a person who needs a transition between what they've been inside and what they're returning to, the decompression that some underground experiences require before the surface is manageable. I've filed the documentation with the regional archive and with a contact at the State Archaeological Survey who handles cave site assessments. The assessment process has been proceeding for 18 months, with the particular pace that bureaucratic processes apply to discoveries that don't fit neatly into existing categories. The archaeologist I've been working with is careful and thorough, and has said consistently that the marks require more analysis before he can characterize them with confidence. He's said it enough times that I've stopped expecting a different answer and started understanding the consistency of the response as its own kind of answer. What I know is what the room contained, and what the room's geometry said about how it had been accessed. 3 sumps in sequence protecting a chamber that the geological indicators hadn't suggested, and that emerged from the sump exit as if it had been waiting for whoever could reach it. A room with marks on every wall made by something that had been there before me, and that had reached the room by a route I cannot identify, and that had covered the walls with intention, and had done so long enough ago that the marks show. The particular aged quality of marks that have been on rock, for a duration that the reference points I have are insufficient to measure. The room is still there. I've been back twice, both times with proper equipment and a partner, both times finding the room unchanged, the marks as I documented them, the chamber holding what it holds, in the dry still air beyond 3 water barriers in a cave system, with no official name. In a county where the karst goes deep, and the record of who has been inside it is incomplete in ways that discoveries, like this one, confirm are more significant than the record. Suggests something was in that chamber before I was. Something that could reach it, and that had things to say on the walls, and that said them carefully, and that left the room in the condition of a place that is used and then preserved, not abandoned, but maintained in the way you maintain a space that you intend to return to. I think about that. The returning, whether whatever made the marks is still making them somewhere in the system I haven't reached yet, whether the survey I've done represents the part of the cave it wanted found, and the part it didn't want found is behind water I haven't pushed yet, or rock I haven't identified as a passage. 3 sumps protected the room. 3 sumps is a significant barrier. Whatever was in that chamber chose to be in a place that was hard to reach. That's not accident, that's preference. And the preference for a room behind 3 sumps in an unmapped cave in Bath County, West Virginia, is a preference for privacy that has been maintained long enough and deliberately enough that I find myself respecting it in ways that my training didn't prepare me to respect, and that I'm still learning how to carry. The joint survey had been planned for 6 weeks before the November Saturday we went in. I want to give you the planning, because the planning is part of what made what happened in the cave so difficult to process. The particular gap between a carefully organized undertaking and the thing that the undertaking encountered. The contrast between the preparation and the outcome that has occupied me since. 2 grottos, 2 entrances, 1 cave system. The geological evidence for the connection had been building for years. The regional karst survey suggesting that the 2 known entrances on opposite sides of the Monroe County Ridge were likely accessing the same system at different points. The hydrology of the area consistent with a single drainage that the ridge divided on the surface and connected beneath it. Establishing the connection was a project that both grottos had been interested in for different reasons. Ours because of the survey documentation and the regional archive, the Eastern Grotto, because their members had found the east entrance to the previous spring and were motivated by the particular excitement that a new entrance generates in a caving community, the possibility of new passage and new territory, and the specific satisfaction of connecting 2 known points through unknown terrain. The plan was straightforward. Our team of 4 would enter from the west and proceed east toward the connection point. The eastern team of 4 would enter from their entrance and proceed west. We would communicate by radio at half-hour intervals, each team reporting position and progress, the joint survey building the connection from both ends simultaneously. We had each other's survey notes, shared beforehand, so that each team understood what the other had already documented and where the expected connection would occur. The Eastern team's notes said they had mapped to within approximately 200 feet of our expected position at a passage junction that their survey called the canyon section, a tight vertical-walled passage that widened into a larger horizontal trunk about 150 feet from their current survey terminus. Our notes said we expected to reach the canyon section from our side at approximately 600 feet from our entrance. The math said the teams would meet somewhere in the canyon section, the connection passage between two survey terminus points that were 200 feet apart. We went in at 8 in the morning. Our team was myself, a veteran caver named Paul who had been doing this for 20 years and who had more survey miles in Monroe County caves than anyone I knew, a woman named Cassie who was newer to the region but technically strong, and a member of our grotto named Frank, who was methodical and steady and who I trusted in tight situations. 4 people, each carrying a full day of food and water and survey gear, the standard kit for a day push into a connected system. We had radio contact with the surface support, a member of the grotto who was waiting at our entrance with a cell phone, and the communication plan that our safety protocol required. The first 400 feet of the cave went as expected. The survey we'd been updating for 2 seasons covered this section thoroughly, and the terrain unfolded the way the notes described it. The entrance series tightening into a crawl at about 150 feet, and then opening into the trunk passage that ran east toward the connection zone. The trunk was good cave, tall enough to stand in most of the way. The floor a mix of breakdown and packed sediment. The survey station markers from previous trips still visible on the walls at their documented intervals. We moved at survey pace, which is slower than travel pace. The instruments out, the notebook being filled, the work of documenting the cave proceeding with the particular rhythm that survey work develops when a team has done enough trips together to function efficiently. We reached the canyon section at approximately 10:45. The canyon was exactly as the Eastern team's notes described it, a vertical walled passage maybe 4 feet wide and 20 feet tall. The particular slot canyon character that dissolution along a nearly vertical joint produces when the cave develops upward through the rock rather than laterally. Our headlamps showed the walls close on either side, and the ceiling high above, and the floor a flat mud surface that recorded every boot print with the fidelity that fine cave mud provides. We moved through the canyon in single file, the width requiring it, the survey proceeding from station to station as we documented the passage we were adding to the regional record. Paul was in the lead. He stopped at approximately 11, and I came up behind him, and he said the gear was ahead. His voice carried the particular flat quality of an observation that the observer is still processing, the voice reporting before the interpretation has fully formed. I came alongside him in a slightly wider section of the canyon, and I saw what he was looking at. The gear was staged in the passage, maybe 30 feet ahead. 4 packs, large expedition packs of the kind that a full-day survey team carries, lined against the right wall of the canyon in a row, with the particular organization of packs that have been placed rather than dropped, the organization of gear that a team sets up when they've arrived at a position and have stopped to prepare for a push. Survey equipment was laid out on top of the packs, the instruments and the notebooks and the flagging tape and the other materials that survey work requires, laid out in the methodical way of people who are organized and who set their gear up in a way that makes efficient access possible. Rope was coiled on the floor beside the packs, a 40-meter coil in a neat pile that said the team had anticipated a vertical section ahead and had staged the rope for deployment. The Eastern team's gear, their packs had the carabiner clips and the logo patches that identified them as members of the Eastern Grotto, small identifiers that I registered automatically and confirmed what the staging had already suggested. Their gear, here, staged for a push into the passage we were standing in, 200 feet from where their survey notes had placed their terminus. They were not with the gear. The canyon ahead of the staged equipment was empty of people. The mud floor, which showed our own boot prints behind us, and which showed the boot prints of the Eastern team ahead of us, the prints coming from the east and stopping at the gear staging area in the configuration of 4 people who had arrived and had set down their packs, showed the prints continuing past the staging area, going east and then turning and going west into the deeper section of the canyon, the direction away from their entrance and the direction we had not yet surveyed. I counted the sets of prints past the staging area. 4 sets going west, deeper into the cave, away from both entrances, away from the surface. No prints returning. The mud showed the going and not the coming back. Paul called out. The standard call that cavers use when they announce their presence. The grotto name and a general hello projected down the canyon with enough volume to carry the distance that the passage allowed. The canyon carried the sound west in the particular efficient way that narrow vertical passages transmit sound, the walls conducting the call forward with the clarity of an acoustic channel that the geology had inadvertently optimized. The passage returned no answer. The eastern section of the canyon held our echo for a moment and then held silence. We called twice more. Cassie tried with her higher voice, the variation in frequency sometimes reaching differently through cave acoustics, and the canyon took her call and returned nothing. Frank stood at the gear staging area and looked at the packs and the laid-out equipment and said they must be just ahead, and his voice had the quality of a person making an argument to themselves rather than to us. We went forward. Not immediately, not without the brief discussion that the situation required. The four of us in the canyon, with the staged gear, and the one-directional boot prints, and the unanswered calls, having a quiet conversation about what the protocol was. The protocol in a joint survey when the other team is unaccounted for at a junction point is to advance and locate them, the assumption being that communication failure is more likely than anything else, and that the other team is in the passage ahead and unaware that we'd arrived. We advanced on that assumption. It was the reasonable assumption given what we knew and what we didn't know, and the reasonable assumption took us forward about 100 feet past the staging area. The sound came from approximately 200 feet ahead of us, from the point where the canyon bent and the view of the passage ended. It came once and stopped, and we stood in the canyon and processed it in the particular stillness of four people who have heard the same thing at the same time and who are checking their understanding against each other's faces before they respond to it. I have tried to describe the sound in the survey notes I filed and in the conversations I've had since, and the description is consistently inadequate. It occupied the frequency between a voice and something that is not a voice. The frequency range where the distinction between the two categories becomes difficult to maintain, where what you're hearing could be language processed through conditions that have distorted it, or could be something that has the rhythm and the intention of language without being language. It was not an echo. It was not the settling or the dripping, or any of the geological sounds that caves produce. It had the character of a sound that was being made, that was being generated by something in the passage ahead, that was directed along the canyon toward us, with the particular quality of a sound that knows where it is going. I looked at Paul. Paul was already looking at me. Cassie and Frank were behind us, and I could hear their breathing, but they weren't speaking, and the cave was silent again after the sound, and we stood in the silence for what I think was about 10 seconds. Then Paul turned around, and I turned around, and Cassie and Frank turned around, and we moved back through the canyon toward the staging area, and past it, and into the trunk passage and west toward our entrance at a pace that was not running, because running in cave passage is how you get hurt, and because the particular discipline that experience provides said to move fast and move controlled and not to run. We radioed the surface at the trunk passage, reported our position and that we were returning. The surface support asked if we'd made the connection. Paul said we'd found the other team's gear but not the team, and that we were coming out and that the eastern grotto needed to be contacted. The surface support asked if we needed emergency services. Paul said he didn't know yet. He said it in the flat voice that he'd used when he first saw the gear and that had not changed in quality since. We were out by 1:30. The eastern grotto was reached by 2. Their team had gone in at 7, and their check-in at 9:30 had been normal, position reported as the canyon section, about to stage gear for the push west. Their check-in at 10 had gone unanswered. They had not been concerned because radio in tight canyon passage is unreliable, and a missed check-in is a normal occurrence. By 2 in the afternoon when we reached them, they had been trying the radio for 3 hours and had been preparing to initiate the emergency protocol. The eastern team was found at 4:15 that afternoon by a combined search team that went in from both entrances. They were in the canyon section, approximately 50 feet past the bend where the sound had come from, sitting in the passage in a configuration that the search team described as orderly, the 4 of them seated against the wall of the canyon in a row, conscious and physically uninjured, unresponsive to questions, for approximately 20 minutes after they were reached. When they became responsive, they said they didn't know how long they'd been sitting. They said they'd heard something in the passage and had stopped and then couldn't account for the time between stopping and the search team arriving. Their survey notes from the session ended at a point approximately 30 feet past where they'd staged their gear, a notation that was complete and formatted in the normal way, and that stopped mid-passage with no indication of why the documentation had ended. I've been in Monroe County caves many times since. I've completed the connection survey with a different team on a different visit. The passage documented, the junction established, the regional archive updated with the survey data that the November trip was supposed to produce. The canyon section is cave passage, the particular limestone slot that the geology created, unremarkable in the way that most cave passage is unremarkable when the cave is doing what caves do. But I remember the sound that came from around the bend at 200 feet. I remember what it occupied in the frequency range between what voices are and what other things are. I remember the 10 seconds of silence after it, and the 8 feet of turning and moving that the 10 seconds produced without a word between 4 people who had all heard the same thing and who all reached the same conclusion through some process that bypassed the discussion entirely. The passage returns silence now when I'm in it. The canyon holds its geological character, and the survey stations mark the walls at their documented intervals, and the mud floor shows only the prints of cavers who went in and came back out. But the eastern team sat against that wall for however long they sat there, and their notes end mid-sentence, and whatever was in the passage came from around the bend once and then was quiet. And 4 experienced cavers sat in the dark and couldn't account for the time until someone came and found them. And I think about what made them sit down. What in that frequency between voice and not voice produced 4 people sitting quietly in a cave passage waiting without knowing they were waiting or what they were waiting for. I don't go past the bend alone. That's the line I've drawn. And I've drawn it not from the sound itself, but from what the sound produced in 4 people who are, by training and by temperament, not easily produced into anything. They sat down. That's what I keep coming back to. Whatever was around the bend made 4 experienced cavers sit down and lose track of the time. And it did it with a sound. One sound. From around a bend in a limestone canyon in Monroe County, West Virginia. And then it was quiet, and they sat. And they didn't know how long. Vertical caving requires a particular relationship with exposure that horizontal caving doesn't. When you're moving through a cave passage, even a tight one, you have the ground under you and the walls beside you and the ceiling above you, the enclosed space providing the particular psychological containment that enclosed spaces provide, even when the enclosure is the thing that the claustrophobic person fears. In a vertical pit, you have the rope and the void and nothing else. The shaft dropping below you and rising above you, and the only thing between you and the bottom being the equipment on your harness, and the anchor at the top and the technique that training has built into you over however many years. You've been hanging on ropes in the dark. I've been doing vertical work for 9 years. Rigging, rappelling, ascending, the full complement of skills that single rope technique requires. Applied in West Virginia pits that range from 30-foot entrance drops to the significant vertical work in systems like Seneca Caverns and the deep pits in the Greenbrier Valley Karst, where the geology produces the kind of vertical relief that keeps people coming back. 9 years of being comfortable in the void, of having made the particular peace with hanging in empty space, that vertical caving demands, and that the piece, once made, holds against most of what the pits produce. The pit in Nicholas County was not the most significant vertical work I'd done or the most technically demanding. 120 feet, a clean shaft, good rock at the anchor. The rigging straightforward, and the descent and ascent manageable by anyone with solid single rope technique, and the patience to take the time that 120 feet of rope demands. I'd been in it twice before, both times with small teams, both times for the purpose of documenting the passages at the bottom that connected to a lower level and that the regional survey said were worth adding to the archive. The pit had a name in the grotto's records, a local name I won't use here, and it had the reputation that many Nicholas County pits have, the reputation of being good vertical practice, with interesting cave below, nothing unusual, nothing that the 2 previous visits had produced that would have suggested a 3rd visit would be different. I went back alone in late September. The 3rd visit solo is the decision I keep having to account for when I tell this story, the choice that the subsequent events make look worse in retrospect than it looked in the planning, though I'll say again what I've said before about solo caving decisions, that the risk calculation is real, and that I made it with the information I had, and that the calculation was wrong in ways I couldn't have predicted, because what was in the pit on that September morning was not something that the risk calculations variables included. The surface access to the pit is through a section of second-growth hardwood forest that the September morning had converted to the particular amber and gold that the early fall produces in the mountains before the color peaks. The trees not yet at their maximum display, but turned enough that the walk from the parking pull-off through the woods to the pit entrance was the kind of morning walk that makes you feel the particular rightness of being where you are at the time you're there. The pit entrance is a hole in the forest floor, approximately 8 feet across, the opening rimmed with moss and fern, and the particular vegetation that pit entrances accumulate when they've been open long enough to develop their own microclimate. The cool air rising from the shaft, keeping the entrance cool through the summer, and producing the condensation that the moisture-loving plants require. I rigged the anchor in the hemlock that I'd used on both previous trips, the tree solid and well-rooted, the rigging going up quickly with the familiarity that repeated use of the same anchor point provides. I started down at approximately 9:30. The shaft opened below me as I descended, the entrance circle above shrinking with the distance, the pit walls showing the gray limestone of the Nicholas County karst, with the particular texture of rock that dissolution has worked on for geological time, the surface pitted and irregular and beautiful, in the way that rock is beautiful when you're close enough to see its texture and have enough light to appreciate it. My headlamp showed the walls in the radius that the beams covered, and the rest of the shaft was dark, the void below unlit until the beams swept it, the pit producing the particular visual experience of descending through a cylinder of illuminated stone surrounded by darkness. The cold arrived at 60 feet, not gradually, not with the progressive temperature change that you'd expect from a thermal gradient in a large airspace, where the temperature shifts over multiple feet of vertical distance as you move through layers of air at different temperatures. The cold arrived as a threshold, the particular abrupt transition of crossing a boundary rather than moving through a gradient, the temperature on the rope at 59 feet being the normal cave air temperature, and the temperature at 60 feet being something else entirely. 20 degrees colder is my best estimate, made without an instrument in the moment, and confirmed later when I went back with a thermometer. The temperature differential between the air above and below the cold layer, and the air within it, measuring 18 degrees on 2 subsequent visits, and 21 degrees on a third. 20 degrees is a significant thermal anomaly. 20 degrees is the difference between comfortable cave air in September and air that makes your hands stiff and your breath visible, and that produces the physical response of significant cold in a body that was dressed for 55-degree underground temperature. I stopped on the rope, the standard practice when something unexpected occurs during a descent, the body stopping before the mind has fully processed the instruction to stop, the training producing the halt that the anomaly required. I hung at 60 feet with the cold surrounding me, and I ran the inventory of possible explanations that experience provides in these moments. Thermal layering in cave air is real. The stratification of air masses, at different temperatures that occurs in vertical shafts, when the exchange with the surface is limited, and when the shaft geometry creates the conditions for stable thermal layers. I've felt it before, the gradual shift of air temperature as you descend through a pit, the cooler air settling in the bottom of the shaft, where the lower elevation and the reduced exchange with the warmer surface air allows it to accumulate. What I was hanging in at 60 feet was not that. The layer was too sharp and too intense, the temperature differential too large and too confined to the particular band that I was hanging in, the air above and the air below both showing the normal cave temperature that my previous visits had established as the shaft's ambient. This layer was not a product of normal thermal stratification. This layer was something else occupying a specific section of the pit. I hung on the rope, and I noted the cold, with the clinical precision that training provides when the trained part of you is functioning and the other part of you is doing something else. I noted the temperature differential and the layer's apparent thickness, maybe 6 feet of intense cold between relatively normal air above and below. I looked up the shaft at the entrance circle, the morning light showing a pale oval maybe 60 feet above me. I looked down the shaft at the pit floor, visible in my headlamp beam at another 60 feet below, the breakdown pile and the passages that the floor connected to showing in the light, with the particular clarity that vertical pits provide when the bottom is in range of your lighting. The cold moved. I need to describe this as accurately as I can, and I need you to understand that what I mean by moved is not that the cold air in the layer shifted the way air shifts in a draft. The lateral movement of air that temperature differential and pressure produce in cave passages. The cold layer moved vertically. The band of intense cold, the section of the shaft that was 20 degrees colder than the air above and below it, shifted upward. Not quickly, not the movement of air in a sudden current. Slowly and with a particular deliberateness, the cold climbing the shaft wall in the way that something climbs a shaft wall when it is choosing to climb, rather than being moved by a physical process. It moved toward me. The layer shifted upward from the 60-foot position where I'd entered it, the cold band rising along the shaft with the direction that toward me describes, because I was above it on the rope and it was coming toward me. And the rate of the movement was slow enough that I had time to process it and to observe it and to make the particular decision that the processing and the observing produced. I ascended. The training for emergency ascent on a single rope produces a pace that the adrenaline of a genuine emergency improves upon. The physical mechanics of ascending a rope being converted by the body's particular response to threat into a pace that I've never matched in practice sessions. I was moving up the rope before I had fully articulated the decision to move, the body's assessment of the situation preceding the mind's by whatever interval the nervous system's processing requires. And the ascent was the fastest single rope climb I've done in 9 years of vertical caving. I came out of the cold layer at approximately 65 feet, the temperature returning to the normal cave air that the shaft held above the band. The cold released from my body as I ascended through the boundary and the warmth, relative warmth, the 55-degree ambient air, being the particular relief that normal temperature provides after the 20-degree cold that the band had contained. I did not stop ascending. I kept climbing to the surface. The entrance circle arrived around me and the September morning was there. The amber and gold of the forest and the cool surface air and the hemlock that I'd rigged my anchor from and the moss at the pit rim. I sat on the forest floor, at the edge of the pit entrance, with my harness still on and my descender still clipped, and the rope still running down into the shaft. And I breathed the surface air, and I looked at the trees, and I let the distance between the surface and what was 60 feet below the surface do whatever work distance can do in that situation. I went back twice with instruments. The cold layer was present both times, the thermometer confirming the temperature differential, the layer sitting at approximately the same depth in the shaft with the same characteristics, the same sharp upper boundary and the same gradual lower boundary and the same 20-degree differential from the ambient. On neither subsequent visit did the layer move. It sat in the shaft in the position where I'd first entered it and stayed there for the duration of my measurements, and did not demonstrate the vertical movement that the September descent had produced. On neither subsequent visit did I feel the particular quality that the cold had had on the September descent, the active quality of a temperature that is being generated rather than maintained, the cold of something producing the thermal anomaly, rather than the cold of an anomaly that has produced itself. I filed the temperature data in the survey notes with the documentation that the anomaly warranted. The notation says, cold layer at 60 feet, 18 to 21 degree differential, from ambient mechanism undetermined. The mechanism undetermined is the language that survey documentation uses when the observation is documented and the explanation isn't available. It's accurate. The mechanism is undetermined. But I know what the difference was between the September descent and the 2 subsequent visits. On the September descent, the layer moved. On the subsequent visits, it didn't. And the movement on the September descent was toward me, upward along the shaft in the direction that my position on the rope defined, with the particular deliberateness of something that had noticed the person hanging in its territory and had adjusted its position in response to that noticing. I still rigged that pit. The passage at the bottom is worth the vertical work, and the bottom of the shaft is normal cave passage once you're through the layer and past it. I descend through the cold layer now with the particular focus speed that I developed on the September morning. The transition through the cold band made quickly and without stopping, the 60-foot position cleared as fast as the rope allows. I don't hang there anymore. I don't stop at 60 feet and observe and take notes. The observation was completed and the notes were filed, and what the notes contain is what I found. What I found at 60 feet in a 120-foot pit in Nicholas County, West Virginia, on a September morning in the amber and gold of the early fall, was a cold that moved when it wanted to and was still when it wanted to, and that I disturbed when I entered its territory. And that told me, in the only language a thermal layer in a vertical pit has available, that it had noticed me, and that it was adjusting, and I got off the rope before it finished adjusting. That's the end of the story, and the end I hold on to when I'm rigging that anchor in the hemlock and checking my equipment and looking at the entrance circle and knowing that 60 feet down the shaft, the cold is where the cold is, waiting in the dark the way it always waits, in the temperature it maintains for reasons the survey notes describe as undetermined. And I descend through it fast, and I come back up through it fast, and it doesn't move on the subsequent visits. And I don't know if that's because it's not there or because I don't stop. The permit had taken 2 months to process through the DNR, which was about the normal timeline for a bat colony cave access permit in West Virginia, the regulatory process balancing the research value of the survey work against the disturbance risk to the colony, and producing, after the review period and the species assessment and the standard back and forth with the regional biologist, a document that authorized our team to enter the Logan County cave system on specified dates between May and August, outside the winter hibernation period, and before the maternity season ended. We had the permit and we had the key, the physical key that the DNR regional office issued with the permit, a specific key cut for the specific padlock on the specific gate that the DNR had installed in 2009 to protect the cave. The key was with our team leader, a woman named Sandra, who had managed more cave surveys in this region than anyone else in our grotto, and who had dealt with the DNR permit process enough times to know exactly what the process required and to produce the documentation that satisfied it. We arrived at the cave entrance at 6 in the morning on a Saturday in early May. 4 people with a full day of survey equipment and the particular early morning energy that the beginning of a significant survey generates. The cave was in a hollow off a county road about 20 minutes from Logan, the entrance reached by a quarter-mile walk through second-growth hardwood that was just leafing out in the particular tender green of early May, the leaves small and the light filtering through them at that early hour, in a way that made the hollow look like the illustration of a hollow rather than the thing itself. The entrance was at the base of a sandstone escarpment, the cave mouth a horizontal slot maybe 3 feet tall and 6 feet wide, the DNR gate installed across it in the standard design that the bat protection program uses. Steel bars spaced to allow bat egress while physically preventing human entry without the key. Sandra had the padlock open before the rest of us had fully registered what was in the mud on the other side of the gate. She swung the gate inward on its hinges, and the hinges moved with the slight resistance of hardware that is maintained but not used frequently, the swing of a gate that opens maybe 4 or 5 times a year, and that each opening produces in the metal the particular stiffness of low-frequency use. The gate opened, and our headlamps showed the cave entrance and the mud floor just inside. The boot prints were immediately visible. Fine cave mud at a cave entrance in May, after a wet April that had been keeping the region saturated, holds impressions the way nothing else holds impressions. The surface layer soft and detailed and receptive to any contact that exceeds a light touch. The prints were clear and complete, the full sole impression of boots that had been walking, left and right alternating, the stride of a person moving at a normal walking pace into the cave. They began approximately 4 feet inside the gate, at the point where the mud started, and they continued into the cave in the direction the passage ran, disappearing into the dark beyond the range of our headlamps at the entrance. No prints coming back. I was the first one to say it, the observation arriving in the form of words before I'd consciously decided to speak, the voice reporting what the eyes had confirmed before the mind had finished processing. 1 set of prints going in, the particular bilateral pattern of a single person walking, and no returning prints over the same surface. The mud that the prints were in was the same mud on both sides of each print, undisturbed surface on either side, no indication that the return trip had been made on different ground, or at a different level in the passage, or by any other mechanism that would have avoided the mud that the entry prints crossed. Sandra knelt at the gate threshold and examined the lock and the hinges with the focused attention of someone who is looking for specific evidence and who knows what the evidence would look like if it were present. The lock was a DNR standard padlock, keyed to the specific key she had been issued. the kind of padlock that requires the correct key or significant forced entry to open. She examined the lock body and the shackle, and the hasp it secured, and she stood up and said there was no damage. The lock had not been forced. The hinges, which she also examined, showed no tampering, no bending or cutting or removal and reinstallation. No evidence that the gate had been opened by any means other than the key. The gate required the specific key to open, and the specific key was in Sandra's possession, and had been in her possession since the DNR office issued it 6 weeks earlier. We stood at the gate for probably 5 minutes processing this as a group. The boot prints going in, the lock undamaged, the key in Sandra's hand, the absence of any print returning. 4 people with the training and the experience that years of caving produces, applying the analytical framework that the underground demands, arriving at the same set of observations and finding that the observations did not produce any explanation that the analytical framework could accommodate. Someone had been through the gate before us. That person was in the cave. The mechanism by which they had gotten through a locked gate without the key or forced entry was not available to us from outside the cave. Sandra said we were going in. She said it in the tone that a team leader uses when a decision has been made that is going to be implemented, not a consultation but a statement of direction. And she was right to make it, because standing at the gate debating the impossible was not going to produce information, and the cave was where the information was. We went in. The survey was methodical and thorough, in the way that Sandra's surveys are always methodical and thorough, the kind of work that takes 9 hours, not because the cave is enormous, but because the documentation is complete. Every passage checked, every chamber measured, the survey stations placed at the intervals that the grotto's protocol specifies, and the measurements taken with the precision that the instruments allow. We followed the boot prints as we surveyed, the prints being a feature of the cave floor that the survey needed to document and that provided a navigational thread through the system, as well as an object of ongoing attention. The question of where the prints went and where the person who made them was remaining the second question alongside the primary work of the survey. The prints were consistent throughout. Same boots, same sole pattern, a lug sole boot of the kind that serious hikers and cavers wear. The tread showing a pattern that I noted in the survey log, and that I've since searched without finding a definitive match in any manufacturer's catalog. The pattern close to several current designs, but not identical to any of them. Same stride, same pace, no variation in the spacing that would indicate the person had moved faster or slower or had stopped. The prints moved through the cave with the particular regularity of someone who was not exploring, who was not checking side passages or looking at formations or doing any of the navigation that a person unfamiliar with the cave would do. The prints took the direct route through every passage junction, choosing the correct path toward the cave's deeper sections, without the hesitation and backtracking that an unfamiliar person in an unfamiliar cave produces in the mud. Whoever made the prints knew the cave. The cave had not been entered since our last survey visit the previous August, according to the DNR access log that Sandra had checked before our trip. No permitted entries between August and our May visit. The DNR log showed no entries. The cave had been closed behind the locked gate for 9 months, and the boot prints that knew the cave's layout without hesitation had been made on a mud surface that showed no previous prints to follow. We reached the pit at approximately 3 in the afternoon. It was in the deepest section of the cave, in a passage that our previous survey had documented as ending at a wall approximately 40 feet past the last survey station. The wall was gone. In its place was an opening, a vertical shaft that dropped into the rock at the end of the passage, the pit showing in our headlamps as a hole in the floor approximately 8 feet across. The walls of the shaft visible for maybe 20 feet before the dark absorbed whatever the light could show below that. A new pit. New in the survey sense, meaning not previously documented, not in our survey, and not in any previous survey in the regional archive. The passage had ended at a wall in August, and the wall was now a pit. The boot prints ended at the edge of the pit. Both feet, the last 2 impressions in the mud showing the particular stance of a person who has stopped at the edge of a drop, the toes of the prints almost at the rim, the body weight distribution visible in the depth of the impression showing the person had been standing upright and looking down, and then nothing. No prints pulling back from the edge. No prints indicating a lateral movement to the side. The last two prints were at the rim of a pit that dropped beyond the range of our lights, and beyond those prints the mud was undisturbed. Sandra lay on the cave floor and put her headlamp over the edge and looked down as far as the light reached. She said she could see maybe 30 feet of shaft wall before the dark took over. She said the walls showed no ledges, no horizontal passages branching off, no features that would have allowed lateral movement into the rock. She said the shaft walls looked like a shaft that went down. We rigged a light drop, a spare headlamp lowered on survey tape, and we dropped it maybe 60 feet before the tape ran out. The light showed shaft walls the whole way. We couldn't see the bottom. We documented the pit and we documented the prints at its edge, and we completed the survey notes, and we went out. The gate was still locked behind us, the padlock showing the same undamaged condition on exit that it had shown on entry. We locked it behind us and walked out through the May Hollow in the late afternoon light, and nobody said much on the walk to the cars. I filed the survey with the DNR and included the boot print documentation and the pit discovery, and a specific note about the locked gate and the undamaged lock, and the absence of any permitted or recorded entry between August and our May visit. The DNR biologist who handled our permit sent a response 3 weeks later. She said the bat count from our survey was consistent with the previous year and the colony appeared healthy. She said the new pit was being referred to the Regional Geological Survey for assessment. She said regarding the boot prints, she had no explanation for access through a locked gate with an undamaged lock. She said she had consulted the complete DNR access log for the cave, going back to the gate installation in 2009. She said in 14 years of log records, 3 previous survey teams had reported boot prints at the entrance going in without returning prints. She said each of those reports was in the log, and each was marked as unexplained. She said the gate had never shown damage in 14 years of inspections. She said the key had been issued to 7 different permitted teams over that period, and that the key had been physically present with each team on each visit and had not been duplicated as far as any record showed. She said the cave appears to have a consistent pattern of containing something that enters through a locked gate and does not return through it. She said it in the careful professional language of a government biologist filing a report, and I've read the sentence many times since, and I still find it the most frightening sentence in any document I have from the Logan County cave. Not because of what it says, but because of what it means that she put it in an official report. She didn't have to write it that way. She could have attributed the prints to administrative error, or recording failure, or any of the explanations that official documents use when the alternative is writing what the evidence actually shows. She wrote what the evidence showed. 14 years and 4 survey teams and boot prints going in through a locked gate with an undamaged lock and not coming back. And a pit at the end of the cave that the last prints stop at, and no bottom visible at 60 feet of drop. Underground camping is its own discipline within caving, the particular set of skills and preparations that separates a day trip from a multi-day push, and that the objectives of deep cave exploration eventually require when the targets are far enough below the surface that the commute consumes the available time. 800 feet below the surface in the Pendleton County system, the commute from the entrance to our camp position took approximately 3.5 hours each way. 7 hours of travel that a day trip would have required us to absorb before any exploration could begin. The 4-day underground camp eliminated the commute and gave us 3 full working days at depth, the time necessary to survey the sections of the system that had been identified from the surface as likely extension zones, and that no previous team had been able to reach with enough remaining time to do the work properly. I've done underground camps 4 times in my caving career. The logistics are significant. The food and the sleeping gear, and the changes of clothing, and the additional equipment that 4 people need for 4 days underground, carried in on the first day in loads, that test what a person can manage through the crawls and the climbs and the stream passages that most deep cave systems put between the entrance and the deep sections. The camp itself, once established, has the particular quality of a shelter that is simultaneously the most isolated and the most enclosed shelter you can be in. The rock walls and ceiling that you can touch, and the 800 feet of mountain above you, and the absence of any communication with the surface, and the particular silence of an underground camp at night when the work of the day has stopped and the cave is returned to whatever the cave does, when the people in it are still. The Pendleton County system had been partially surveyed by a university team in the 90s and by our grotto on 2 subsequent trips, the combined documentation building a picture of a deep, complex system with several levels connected by pitches and stream passages, the lower levels the least documented and the most promising for extension. Our camp was on a gravel bank beside the main stream passage at the 4th level down, a flat section of cave floor where the gravel had accumulated over a natural eddy point in the stream, and that provided the relatively flat and relatively dry surface that underground camping requires. The stream ran maybe 10 feet from our sleeping positions. The water, the particular cold of deep cave streams, the sound of it constant and present through the nights, the white noise of moving water that I've come to associate with underground sleep. The first day's survey went well. We pushed approximately 200 meters of new passage in the 4th level's northern extension, the survey stations going in at regular intervals, the notes filling with the measurements and the descriptions that the documentation required. The cave at this depth had the character that very deep caves have, the particular quality of terrain that has been forming far from any surface influence for longer than the shallower sections, the formations larger and more complex, and the passages less regular, the dissolution having worked through the rock at depth, with less constraint from the surface drainage patterns that shape the upper levels. We came back to camp at approximately 7 in the evening of the first day, ate the food that underground camping requires you to eat in the compressed nutrition of spaces where you can't carry bulk, and went to sleep in the sleeping bags that the cave's 54-degree temperature made necessary even in July. The second day was similar. Different direction, the southern extension of the 4th level, more survey stations, more measurements, a significant new chamber that the survey identified as approximately 30 meters across and that required 2 hours of documentation, the formation density warranting the time. We were back at camp by 8, the slightly longer day reflecting the distance to the southern section, and I noted in the camp log that the team was in good condition, the food and the sleep and the water from the filtered stream supply, maintaining the physical capacity that multi-day underground work requires. I noted no unusual observations. I noted the standard cave sounds, the stream and the occasional drip, and the particular settling sounds that rock makes at depth. And I noted them as background, as the ambient condition of the underground environment, the sounds that a cave produces that experienced cavers hear and catalog without distress. I woke at 3 in the morning of the second night, not from a sound, not with a start, but in the gradual way that deep underground sleep produces waking when the body has rested enough and is returning to consciousness on its own schedule without the alarm clock or the light change that surface waking responds to. I lay in the sleeping bag in the dark with my eyes open, the total darkness of 800 feet underground present around me, and I listened to the cave. The stream was there, the constant water sound that had been present since we made camp, the drip from somewhere in the upper passage, irregular, the particular rhythm of water falling from a formation, the settling of rock, the very low frequency sounds that deep caves produce as the mountain adjusts to the thermal and hydraulic conditions that the depth maintains. I lay in the dark and I listened to these sounds, and I felt the gravel of the bank beneath the sleeping pad and the weight of the mountain above me, and I was fully awake and cataloging the cave's ambient acoustic environment with the automatic competence of someone who has slept underground 4 times and knows what the underground sounds like at 3 in the morning. Then the sound from below. The distinction arrived with clarity, not from the stream beside me, not from the passage ahead or behind, not from any horizontal direction that the cave's architecture could have produced, from below, from beneath the gravel, beneath the bedrock that the gravel rested on, transmitted upward through the rock in the way that vibration travels through solid material, the sound coming up through the floor and through the sleeping pad and into my body with the particular quality of sound that is conducted rather than carried, that you feel as much as hear, that arrives in the bones before it arrives in the ears. It was rhythmic, low in frequency, below the range of most cave sounds but above the infrasound that geological processes produce, in the range that the body registers as sound rather than vibration, but at the lower end of that range. The particular frequency that makes the chest cavity respond before the conscious mind has categorized what it's hearing. Rhythmic, in the sense that it repeated the same sound at intervals that I estimated later as approximately 4 seconds, the interval consistent, the repetition not varying in timing or in quality, the particular consistency of something that is producing the sound deliberately and maintaining the production with precision. I became aware that I was not the only one awake. The particular quality of a sleeping space, where the breathing has changed, where the involuntary shifts and sounds of sleeping bodies have stopped, and the silence that conscious wakefulness produces has replaced them, was present in the camp around me. I said nothing. The others said nothing. We lay in our sleeping bags in the dark and we listened to the sound come up through 800 feet of mountain and through the bedrock floor of the passage and through the gravel and into the bodies that were lying on it. I reached for my headlamp. The automatic response to darkness and uncertainty, the instinct to produce light, arrived, and I let it arrive. But when I turned the headlamp on, the light showed me the camp and the passage walls and the stream 10 feet away and the ceiling above us, and nothing that was producing or that could account for the sound coming from below. The light illuminated what it illuminated, and what it illuminated was the cave, as we had established camp in it, and the sound continued from beneath the floor, while the headlamp showed me that the floor was gravel over bedrock, and that the gravel and the bedrock were where they had been when I went to sleep. I turned off the headlamp. I lay back down. The other headlamp stayed off. The other 3 members of the team making the same calculation I had made, which is that the light was not going to address the source of the sound, and that the dark was what the cave was, and that lying in the dark and listening was the correct relationship to maintain with what we were hearing until we had more information than the night was going to provide. 20 minutes. I timed it on the watch that I keep on my wrist on underground trips, the timing habit of a surveyor applied to the particular duration of an experience I needed to document. 20 minutes of the rhythmic low sound coming up through the bedrock floor of a stream passage 800 feet underground, 4 people lying in their sleeping bags listening to it without speaking, the cave holding the sound, and the stream running beside us, and the mountain above us, and whatever was below us, producing the rhythm with the consistency of something that knows what it is doing and does not vary from it. The sound stopped. Not gradually, not fading, not producing the diminishing quality that sounds produce when their source is moving away. It stopped in the same way it had started, at full volume and then not present. The transition from there to absent as clean as the transition from absent to there had been. The cave returned to its ambient sounds, the stream and the drip and the deep settling of rock, and the 4 of us lay in our sleeping bags in the dark, and the silence continued for a while before anyone spoke. Paul said it first. He said, "Is everyone awake?" And we all said yes, and the confirmation of shared experience passed between us in the particular relief that shared experience provides when the alternative is being alone with something you can't verify. We lay in the dark for maybe another 15 minutes without any of us deciding to sleep again, and then Sandra turned on her headlamp and sat up and said she was going to make notes, and she made notes in the camp log, and I made notes in my personal log, and we wrote what we had heard, and we wrote the duration and the frequency estimate and the direction of transmission and the fact that it had stopped. And we wrote it all in the clinical language of people who are trained to document what they observe and who are applying that training to something that the training was not designed for. We did not investigate the floor. I want to be clear about this because the investigation would have been meaningless. The bedrock under the gravel being bedrock, solid and opaque, and showing nothing to eyes and lights that was different from what bedrock shows in any cave passage, and because the investigation impulse was present in each of us, and was present alongside the other impulse, the older and quieter one. That said, the floor of the passage was the floor, and that what was below the floor was below the floor, and that the 200 meters of rock between us and whatever the sound had originated in was not a distance we could close by looking at the gravel. We finished the survey over the following 2 days. The work was done, the survey stations in, the documentation complete, the Pendleton County System's 4th level added to the regional archive in the way that the push had been planned to add it. The work proceeded with the professional focus that the team brought to it, and we came out on the 4th day, through the 3.5 hours of passage that the commute required, and we were on the surface by late afternoon, and the surface was July and warm, and the particular overwhelming quality of being outside after 4 days underground was present in all of us. I filed the survey with the full documentation. The survey coordinator who processed it contacted me about the camp log notation, the rhythmic sound from below on the second night, and asked whether I had a geological explanation. I told her I didn't. She said she'd contacted a geologist with karst experience and asked about the possibility of hydraulic resonance, the particular sound that underground water systems can produce under certain flow conditions, resonating through connected passages in patterns that can sound rhythmic and that can be transmitted through bedrock. The geologist said hydraulic resonance was possible, but that the conditions that produced it were inconsistent with the described frequency and duration, and that the 4-second interval was not a characteristic of any hydraulic resonance phenomenon he was familiar with. He said, according to the survey coordinator's email, that the consistency of the interval was the detail that gave him pause. He said natural sound production in cave systems was variable, that the geological and hydraulic processes that generate cave sounds were not precision mechanisms, and that the variations they produced in their rhythms were detectable. He said a 4-second interval maintained for 20 minutes without variation was not what those processes produced. He said that in his experience, the sounds that maintained that kind of consistency had a source that was maintaining them deliberately. He put it in an email to the survey coordinator, and she forwarded it to me with a note that said she thought I should have it. I've kept it. The geologist's phrasing, the sounds that maintained that kind of consistency had a source that was maintaining them deliberately, is the phrase I return to when the memory of that gravel bank at 3 in the morning comes back, and when the particular feeling of a sound coming up through rock from a direction that had no documented source reasserts itself in whatever part of the brain holds the things it cannot fully file. 800 feet below the surface, on a gravel bank beside a stream in a passage that nothing about the geological survey said was anything other than a passage, and below the bedrock, in a space that no survey has identified and that no light we had could reach, something maintained a rhythm for 20 minutes, with an interval so consistent that a geologist reading my documentation used the word deliberately. I've been back to Pendleton County twice since. The 4th level surveys have been extended, the system growing in the regional archive with each trip. The gravel bank campsite has been used again on both subsequent visits, the logistics being the same logistics and the camp position being the best available option at that depth. The second night of both subsequent trips, I lay on the sleeping pad on the gravel and I listened. The stream ran, the drip fell, the rock settled. The particular ambient sounds of 800 feet of mountain surrounded me. The sound from below has not returned. Both times I listened for it specifically, the 20-minute event that the camp log documented, and both times the floor held its silence through the night. But I check. Every night underground, at depth, I check. And the check is involuntary, the body performing it before the mind decides to, the ears orienting downward toward the bedrock and the gravel and the 200 meters of rock beneath the floor, and attending to what might be coming up through it. The mountain is deep, deeper than the surveys go. Whatever is at the depth the surveys haven't reached yet knows how to make sound travel through bedrock and knows how to maintain a rhythm that a geologist calls deliberate. And it produced that rhythm once, on one night, in one camp, and has been silent in the same location since. I don't know if that silence means it stopped. I think it means it finished whatever the 20 minutes of rhythm was for, and that the finishing was sufficient, and that whatever comes next, if anything comes next, will come in its own time, and at the depth it chooses, and not at a depth we've reached yet. The survey continues. The system gets deeper with each push, and the floor of the 4th level passage holds its silence. So far, 11 years of photographing the same cave teaches you to see change at the scale that geological time produces, which is to say it teaches you to see almost no change at all. This is the particular discipline that the work imposes, the calibration of attention to a process so slow that the evidence it produces in any human-scale time frame is at the edge of measurable, the millimeter per century growth of a stalactite accumulating across decades of documentation into changes that the instruments confirm and that the eye cannot detect without the photographs as reference. I've been doing this work long enough that I know the fourth chamber of the Greenbrier County system, the way I know the rooms of the house I grew up in. Not consciously, not by deliberate recall, but in the body, in the way that a space you've occupied hundreds of times becomes part of the spatial memory that operates below the level of thought, and that produces the particular recognition of wrongness when something in the space has changed. The cave is in the valley east of Lewisburg, on private land that the owner has permitted my access to under a formal research agreement since I first contacted him in 2013. The system is not commercially developed and has never been. The owner's family, having owned the land for several generations without doing anything with the cave beyond exploring it casually and occasionally showing it to neighbors. The particular informal relationship between mountain families and the caves on their land that predates any regulatory framework or any conception of caves as resources requiring documentation. I came to the owner with photographs from a preliminary survey I'd done with a university colleague, and with the argument that what was in the fourth chamber warranted serious documentation, and he agreed. And the research agreement we've maintained since has given me access on a schedule of my choosing, with the understanding that I share my documentation with him and that I leave the cave as I find it. The fourth chamber is why the cave is worth the 11 years, not the first chamber or the second or the third, which are good caves with good formations of the quality that the Greenbrier karst produces throughout the county, but the fourth, which is a room that the cave's hydrology created in circumstances that the geologist in me can describe in general terms, and that the particular formations the room contains exceed in significance. The helictites in the fourth chamber are the most extensive I've documented in the eastern United States. The formations that grow against gravity in the ways that physics seems to prohibit, curving and branching in directions that defy the vertical pull that all other formations obey, building themselves in 3 dimensions according to some internal logic of fluid dynamics and capillary pressure that the formation science still debates. Documenting these formations is the work. The photographs and the measurements and the growth rate calculations that 11 years of visits have produced are a dataset that does not exist for any comparable formation complex in the regional literature. My documentation protocol is fixed. I arrive at the same time of year for each visit. The schedule designed to provide consistent seasonal conditions for the photography, and I use the same camera positions that I established in the first year, the fixed points in the chamber from which each formation is photographed on every visit. The spatial consistency that makes the comparison between visits possible and that makes the changes, when they are real changes, visible. 17 fixed camera positions in the fourth chamber alone. The positions marked with small reflective dots that I applied to the chamber walls in the first year and that my camera aligns to on each subsequent visit. From each position, the same formations are photographed with the same lens at the same distance. The photographs from 11 years of visits can be stacked and compared with the particular confidence that methodological consistency provides. I went in March as I always go in March, the specific week in the 3rd month that my visit schedule designates as the spring documentation. 4 days in the cave. The full protocol applied to all 4 chambers. The 17 fourth chamber positions photographed in the order I've photographed them for 11 years. The measurements taken with the equipment that the research agreement's budget has allowed me to upgrade twice since the documentation began. The fourth chamber was as I had left it in November. The interval since my last visit, having produced the particular unchanged quality that 5 months produces in a space where the relevant time frame is geological. I documented it. I noted nothing unusual. I filed the March data with the university database that houses the project's archive. I went back in June. The June visit is a supplemental session, not part of the formal protocol, added to the schedule 3 years ago, when the growth rate analysis suggested that a second annual measurement point would improve the precision of the accumulation data. I go in June with a reduced kit. The measurements and the photography following the same protocol, but the session shorter, a day and a half rather than 4 days. The work focused on the formations where the growth rate data had been most variable and where the additional measurement point added the most value. I set up at fixed position 7 on the first afternoon of the June visit. Position 7 is in the northeast section of the fourth chamber. facing the wall cluster that contains, among other formations, the primary helictite grouping that is the centerpiece of the documentation project. The formation cluster I've been photographing from this position since March of 2014. I set the camera on the tripod, aligned the lens to the reflective position dot on the chamber wall, adjusted the framing to match the reference photograph from the 11-year archive, and looked through the viewfinder. The formation was wrong. I need to be precise about what I mean by wrong, because precision is the discipline the work has produced in me, and because imprecision would misrepresent what the photographs show. The main stalactite in the cluster, the formation that I've been photographing from position 7 for 11 years, the particular pendant of limestone that my documentation has measured and photographed from this specific angle in every visit since 2014, was not oriented the way the March photographs showed it oriented. The tip of the stalactite, which hangs from the ceiling in the way that stalactites hang, pointing downward under the influence of gravity and the slow drip of mineral-laden water that builds them, was pointing in a direction that the March photographs showed it had not been pointing 3 months earlier. I took the photographs. I took them with the automatic continuation of protocol that training produces when the conscious mind is occupied with something else, the hands performing the documentation, while the brain processed what the viewfinder was showing. Then I opened the March photographs on the laptop I carry for field comparison, and I held the screen next to the viewfinder, and I looked at both. The tip of the stalactite in March pointed northwest relative to the chamber orientation I use in my documentation notes. The stalactite in June, photographed from the same position with the same alignment, the chamber walls in the same position relative to the frame, the other formations in the cluster showing their documented positions without change, had a tip pointing northeast. 12 degrees of difference between the March photograph and the June photograph, the formation occupying a different spatial orientation than it had occupied 3 months earlier in a chamber where nothing should have changed at all, and certainly nothing should have changed in a direction that the growth process of a stalactite does not produce. I put down the camera and I stood in the fourth chamber and I looked at the formation. It looked the way the June photographs showed it, the tip angled northeast in the particular orientation that the comparison with March made strange, and that the standalone observation, without the March reference, would not have made strange at all. The formation was a stalactite. It looked like a stalactite. It had the particular character of a well-developed calcite pendant that had been building since the cave's hydrology produced the drip line that fed it, the surface showing the laminated texture of accumulated deposition, the shape consistent with the growth history that 11 years of documentation had tracked. It was the formation I had been documenting for 11 years. It was oriented differently than it had been in March. I measured it. The same measurement protocol I'd applied on every previous visit, the caliper measurements and the length and the orientation recorded in the field notes with the precision that the instruments provided. The measurements confirmed what the photographs showed. The tip's orientation had changed between March and June by an amount that the growth process of cave formations does not produce in any time frame that human observation covers, let alone in 3 months. I checked the other formations in the cluster. The helictites were where they had been in March. The secondary stalactites were where they had been. The stalagmites on the chamber floor below the cluster were where they had been. The specific formation, the primary stalactite at position 7, was the one that had moved, and the movement was localized to that formation, and was not a condition of the chamber or a systematic error in my measurement. I spent the rest of the June visit documenting the discrepancy. Every angle, every measurement, the comparison between the June observations and the March archive, as complete and as rigorous as I could make it with the equipment I'd brought for what I'd expected to be a routine supplemental session. I filled a field notebook with observations and measurements, and the particular notation of a scientist who is documenting something that the scientific framework they're operating in cannot account for, and who is applying more rigor, not less. Because the anomaly demands more, not less. The cave had been closed since March. The research agreement provided me with the access log, a simple sign-in sheet at the entrance that I'd initiated in the second year of the project to track any non-research visits that might represent a disturbance risk to the formations I was documenting. The March visit was the last entry. 3 months of no access between my March visit and my June visit. 3 months of a gated, locked cave in which nothing human had been present. I called the cave system geologist I work with most closely, a woman named Dr. Hartwell at the university, who has been my scientific collaborator on the documentation project since the second year, and who has the physical science background that my geological training complements. I described what I'd found. She was quiet for a long moment of the kind that I'd come to recognize in her. The silence of a careful scientist considering information against the framework that the information is challenging. She asked me to send the photographs and the measurements before she responded further. She called me back 2 days after I sent the data. She said the documentation was clear, and the comparison methodology was sound, and the discrepancy between the March and June measurements was outside any error range that measurement variability could account for. She said she'd consulted a formation dynamics specialist at another institution who confirmed that the orientation change I documented was not producible by the growth process in any time frame. She said the specialist's assessment was that the physical reorientation of a stalactite of the documented dimensions would require either a seismic event sufficient to register on regional instruments, of which there had been none in the interval, or direct physical manipulation by an agent capable of applying directional force to the formation. She said the phrase, direct physical manipulation, and then she said what she meant by it, which was that something had touched the formation and moved it. Something in the cave, in the 3 months between my visits, had applied force to a stalactite that I had been documenting for 11 years and had changed its orientation by 12 degrees. The cave had no entry in the access log between March and June. The gate was intact on my June arrival. The lock was undamaged. The formation was moved. I've been back 4 times since. The formation has not moved again. The subsequent visits showing the June orientation maintained with the consistency of a formation that is not moving. The measurements agreeing with the June data on each subsequent visit. Whatever moved it once and left it in the new position and has not moved it since. I don't know what to do with that. The onceness of it. 11 years of a formation in one position, and then 3 months of a locked and unvisited cave, and the formation in a different position, and then more years of the formation staying where the 3 months had put it. A single event in 11 years of documentation. A single application of whatever moved it, producing a 12-degree reorientation, and then stopping. I've thought about the direction of the movement. Northeast. 12 degrees from the March position to the June position. The tip of the formation describing an arc in the direction that northeast represents relative to the chamber orientation I use. I've thought about what northeast means in that chamber, and I've thought about what the chamber's northeast quadrant contains and what it leads to, which is the passage that connects the 4th chamber to the 5th chamber, the section of the cave that my research agreement has always designated as off-limits, the passage that the owner specified in the original agreement as a section he preferred not to have disturbed. I've respected that restriction for 11 years. I've documented everything in the first 4 chambers, and I've noted the passage to the 5th in my documentation as a boundary, and I've left it at the boundary. The 5th chamber is not in my data set. It's in the cave, but it's not in my 11 years of work. The stalactite tip points toward the passage that leads to the 5th chamber. It pointed away from it in March. Something moved it to point toward it in June and left it pointing there. I don't know if that's information. I don't know if the movement was deliberate in the sense that deliberate requires an agent with intention, or whether the word deliberate is a projection that my pattern-seeking brain applies to data that has no intention behind it. What I know is what the photographs show and what the measurements confirm. The formation moved. It points northeast now. Northeast is the 5th chamber. And the 5th chamber is where I haven't been. 20 years of vertical caving gives you a relationship with rope that most people don't have with anything. The rope is the connection between the underground and the surface, the single physical link that a vertical caver maintains with the world above the cave, and the management of that connection becomes a practice that the years build into something close to instinct. The rigging and the descent and the ascent performed with the automatic precision of a skill that the body has absorbed so completely that the conscious mind is freed to attend to other things. I check my rigging the way a pilot checks instruments, not because the check requires thought, but because the thought has been replaced by a process that is more reliable than thought. the hands and the eyes running through the verification sequence that 20 years have made permanent. I've rigged Weeping Pit 5 times before the September I need to tell you about. The pit is in a cave system in Pocahontas County that the regional grotto has been working for about 15 years. A deep, complex system with multiple levels and a long list of ongoing survey objectives. The kind of cave that generates careers for the people who commit to it, and that I've been one of those people for most of my adult life in the Appalachian underground. Weeping Pit is the entrance feature of the system's northwest extension. A 180-foot free drop through a shaft that the dissolution process opened vertically along a joint in the limestone, the shaft circular and clean-walled, and dropping straight down to the breakdown pile that covers the floor of the extension's first level. The name comes from the water. The shaft penetrates the water table at a point where a thin-bedded section of the limestone allows significant seepage through the ceiling, the water collecting in the joint above and finding the pit as its drainage route. The result being that in wet weather, the shaft runs wet, the water falling the full 180 feet alongside whoever is on the rope, the particular misery of a wet descent that the local naming tradition captured with the precision that good informal naming always manages. I've descended it in wet conditions twice, and the name earns its accuracy both times. The other 3 descents, including the September trip, were dry, the seasonal low water table, reducing the seepage to nothing, and leaving the shaft clean and vertical, and producing only the slight dampness on the walls that limestone always holds. The September trip was a solo descent. I'll address this directly, because it's the aspect of the trip that the subsequent events make impossible to justify after the fact, and that I can only account for by saying that the vertical section of the northwest extension was the one section of the system that I had always approached. On my own schedule, the solo rigging and descent, a practice that I'd built over years of familiarity with the system and with Weeping Pit specifically, and that the 5 previous successful descents had established in my risk assessment as manageable. The system's horizontal sections I always worked with a team. The vertical entrance I had always treated as my own approach route. The 180 feet of rope work that I was comfortable managing alone, and that put me into the cave system at the level where the survey team would meet me on collaborative trips. The September trip was not a collaborative trip. It was a solo documentation visit, the kind of solo underground work that my background and my comfort level with the system made reasonable in my assessment, and that the September outcome has made me unable to describe as reasonable in any subsequent assessment. I reached the top of the pit at approximately 10 in the morning. The September day was dry and clear, the weather having been dry for 3 weeks, the water table low and the shaft certain to be running dry, the rigging conditions as good as Weeping Pit produced. I set the anchors in the sandstone at the pit entrance, the steel bolts that the grotto had placed in the first year of the system's development and that I'd used on every previous visit. The anchors, solid and tested, and showing no deterioration. I rigged the rope through the anchor system, the 180-foot static line that I'd been descending vertical pitches on for 20 years. The rope checked, and the rigging verified through the protocol that the body performs without requiring the mind to direct it. I attached my descender, weighted the rope, looked down into the shaft. The pit was dry. The walls showed the faint moisture of ambient humidity, and nothing else. No water running. The shaft clean and dark, and dropping to the breakdown floor, 180 feet below. My headlamp showed the upper section of the shaft clearly, and lost the floor in the depth at the edge of the beam's range. I backed over the edge and began the descent. Weeping Pit is a pleasant descent in dry conditions, which is a sentence that non-cavers find strange and that cavers understand immediately. The shaft is clean and the walls are interesting, the limestone showing the geological story of its formation in the strata and the dissolution features that the passing depth reveals. The particular layered history of an ancient seabed, converted by geological time into a vertical underground passage. I descended at the measured pace that controlled descent's use, not rappelling in the recreational sense, but managing the rope with the deliberate control that technical vertical caving requires. The descent, taking maybe 6 or 7 minutes for the full 180 feet. I reached the bottom. The breakdown floor of the extension's first level resolved itself in my headlamp as I descended the final 20 feet, the familiar pile of angular limestone blocks that the shaft ceiling had been depositing over geological time, the floor uneven and requiring attention when you land. I unclipped the descender and stepped off the rope and turned to face the passage entrance. The passage entrance to the Northwest Extension's first-level horizontal section is a low arch in the breakdown, maybe 4 feet tall. The opening formed by the way the breakdown blocks had accumulated and left a navigable gap at the base of the shaft's eastern wall. I've been through that arch 5 times. I know the dimensions, and I know what the arch looks like, and I know the passage behind it. The first-level trunk passage that runs east from the pit floor for about 60 meters before the extension begins. The figure was sitting at the arch. In the opening, the particular space of the passage entrance, the arch framing whatever was in it in the way that an arch frames what occupies it, the shape visible in my headlamp, from the moment I turned away from the rope, with the particular clarity that a headlamp provides, when the subject is close and the darkness beyond it is absolute. Sitting. That's the word, and I've thought about whether another word is more accurate, and I keep coming back to sitting. The posture of a figure that was at rest in the position, with the settled quality that a position has when it's been occupied long enough that the occupation looks natural. Not crouching, not a defensive or a poised posture. Sitting, the way you sit when you're in a place you're comfortable, and when you've been there for a while, and when the sitting is your relationship to the space, rather than a response to a stimulus. I saw it in the first moment of turning. My headlamp found it, and the visual information reached my brain. In the sequence that visual information reaches the brain, the shape first and then the detail, and then the categorization and then the response. The shape said human or human adjacent, the general proportions of a figure with a torso and limbs and a head, the silhouette that a seated humanoid form produces. The detail said the figure was not in distress, was not moving, was not responding to the light that my headlamp was providing after 180 feet of absolute dark. The categorization said this was something sitting at the passage entrance of a cave at the bottom of a vertical shaft in Pocahontas County, and that the categorization had no prior experience to draw on for what that meant. I held the light on it for approximately 10 seconds. I know it was 10 seconds because I've reconstructed the interval many times, and 10 seconds is consistent with what I remember and what the reconstruction produces. 10 seconds of my headlamp on the figure at the passage entrance. The figure showing no response to the light, no movement toward me, no movement at all. The settled quality I mentioned, the quality that the sitting had, was present throughout the 10 seconds. The figure was not reacting to me. The figure was present at the passage entrance in the way that things are present when the presence is their condition rather than their response to anything. I want to be careful about what I describe next, because the description of something seen for 10 seconds at the bottom of a vertical shaft in low light after a 6-minute descent is not a description I can make with the confidence that daylight observation and extended viewing produce. I saw a figure of approximately human dimensions, seated in the passage entrance. The figure's surface was not what I would expect from a person in caving gear. Not fabric, not the texture of clothing or equipment. The surface of the figure had the quality of something that had been in that environment for a long time, and that had taken on the characteristics of the environment, the way things do when the environment has claimed them over sufficient time. Beyond that I won't go, because beyond that is where the 10 seconds and the low light and the shock of the discovery make the description unreliable. My body decided before my mind did. 20 years of vertical caving has built the same instinct into me that 12 years of horizontal caving builds in the passage cavers. The instinct that says here is the thing that the training and the experience have been preparing you to respond to correctly, and the correct response is the exit. My hands found the ascender before I had consciously decided to ascend. The mechanical devices were on the rope and my weight was on the ascenders, and I was moving upward before the mind had finished the calculation that the body had already completed and acted on. I ascended the 180 feet in a time that I later estimated as under 6 minutes, which is faster than I have ever ascended that pitch or any pitch of that length in 20 years of vertical caving. The ascent consumed resources at a rate that left me sitting at the top of the pit in the morning light for approximately 15 minutes before I could stand, the physical effort of the fastest climb of my career, taking its cost in the particular depletion that full exertion produces. I sat at the pit entrance and I breathed, and I did not look back down into the shaft. I pulled the rope. The particular act of a caver who is done with a pitch and who is packing the rope for departure, the rope coming up the shaft in the coil that I gathered at the entrance, the 180 feet of static line retrieved hand over hand. The rope came up clean and empty, and showing nothing unusual, no tension, no resistance, no indication that anything at the bottom of the shaft had interfered with it during my ascent. I drove to the grotto meeting that Thursday, and I told the team leader what I'd seen. He listened with the particular quality of listening that experienced underground managers bring to unusual reports, the attention that neither dismisses nor accepts without examination, the professional reception of information that might need to be acted on. He asked clarifying questions about the figure's position and the duration of my observation and the light conditions and the distance. He asked whether I thought it was another caver. I said I didn't think it was a caver. He asked why. I described what I described to you about the surface quality and the absence of response and the settled character of the sitting, and he was quiet. He told me that the Northwest Extension had been visited 2 months earlier by a team doing a formation survey, and that the team had reported an odor in the first-level horizontal section that they described as unusual. Not the typical cave smell of limestone and moisture, but something older, the particular organic quality of a smell that the underground produces when something biological is present or has been present. The team had documented it and moved on, and the survey had proceeded without incident. He said he'd filed the odor report and hadn't known what to do with it, and that hearing my account, he still didn't know what to do with it, but that now there were 2 accounts pointing at the same section of the same cave. I've been back to Weeping Pit once since September, with a team of 4, and with the explicit objective of documenting the passage entrance at the bottom of the shaft. We descended in order, the team leader first, and he reached the bottom and turned and stood in front of the passage entrance for a moment, and then said, "Come down." The passage entrance was empty. The breakdown floor at the base of the arch showed nothing that could account for a seated figure, no impression in the dust, no evidence of occupation or disturbance. The first-level trunk passage was empty in both directions. We surveyed the first level for 6 hours and found nothing that the previous survey hadn't documented. We came up the rope in order and we coiled the equipment, and we drove back to Lewisburg and we filed the survey notes. I filed a separate account of the September solo visit with the team leader, and he filed it in the grotto's incident log, under the category that the log uses for unexplained observations. I've read the other entries in that category. There are 11 entries over 15 years of working the Pocahontas County system. 3 of them are from the Northwest Extension. 2 of the 3 are from the first-level horizontal section accessed through Weeping Pit. I don't know what was sitting at the passage entrance when I reached the bottom of the shaft in September. I know that it was sitting, and that it was there, and that it did not move in 10 seconds of direct headlamp exposure, and that my body knew what to do about it before my mind did, and that my mind has been grateful for that ever since. The pit is still there. The system is still being worked. The Northwest Extension Survey continues with teams of 4, and with the particular attention to the first-level section that the incident log entries have produced in everyone who has read them. And the passage entrance at the bottom of the shaft is empty when the teams go down. It was not empty in September. That's the fact I carry. The fact in the 10 seconds and the settled quality of a presence that had been in that position for longer than my visit and that had no interest in my light and no response to my arrival. It was already there. It was there before I arrived, and when I left it stayed.